Seeing me holding my newborn son in worn-out clothes in a cramped public hospital room, my billionaire grandfather frowned deeply and asked why $250,000 a month wasn't enough to afford a private maternity suite. I looked at him in complete shock and replied that I hadn't received a single dollar from anyone in the family since I was 18 years old. The color drained entirely from his face, and he immediately stepped into the hallway to call his legal team. I had absolutely no idea that this one brief conversation would unravel a massive, suffocating web of deceit and federal crimes, orchestrated by the very people who were supposed to love me unconditionally. My name is Alyssa. I am 33 years old, working as a freelance children's book illustrator, and my husband David is a dedicated, passionate high school history teacher. We have always lived a modest, quiet life, scraping by entirely on our own terms, asking no one for anything. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed with a low, persistent buzz that gave me a throbbing headache. I was sitting on a hard plastic chair in a cramped, severely underfunded public hospital maternity ward in the heart of Seattle. The walls were painted a dull, peeling institutional green, and the air smelled sharply of harsh bleach and worn linoleum that had seen decades of foot traffic. In my arms, I held my newborn son, Leo. He was beautiful, perfect in every single way, but my heart physically ached when I looked at what he was wrapped in. It was a frayed, faded yellow blanket we had received from a local charity drive, soft from too many washes, threadbare at the edges. I was wearing a worn-out, scratchy hospital gown that had been laundered so many times the fabric was practically transparent. David sat on the edge of the narrow, uncomfortable hospital bed beside me, his shoulders hunched with exhaustion. The dark circles under his eyes stood out starkly against his pale skin. As a high school history teacher, David worked incredibly long hours for very modest pay, and my income as an independent freelance illustrator was unpredictable at best. Feast one month, famine the next. We had been struggling to make ends meet for months, carefully saving every spare penny just to afford the most basic necessities for Leo. We couldn't even afford a proper hospital bassinet. Leo was sleeping in a cheap, scratched plastic tub that the hospital provided specifically for low-income patients. Despite our financial hardships, we loved each other deeply and were absolutely determined to give our son the best life we possibly could with what little we had. The heavy wooden door to our tiny hospital room suddenly swung open, slamming the wall with a loud bang that made both David and me flinch. I instinctively pulled Leo closer to my chest, my heart hammering. Two enormous men in tailored dark suits stepped into the room, their eyes scanning the small space with cold, professional efficiency. Bodyguards. A moment later, my grandfather Harrison walked in. I hadn't seen my grandfather in years. He was 78 years old, a highly successful shipping tycoon who had been living a reclusive life on a sprawling estate in Switzerland for the past decade, largely cut off from the family. He was an imposing figure, standing tall and straight despite his age, leaning slightly on an elegant, custom-made cane. He was dressed in a pristine charcoal gray tailored suit that probably cost more than David and I made in an entire year combined. As Harrison stepped further into the cramped room, he stopped dead in his tracks. His sharp, piercing blue eyes darted around the bleak, depressing space. He looked at the peeling paint on the walls, the stained linoleum floor, the cheap plastic bassinet, and the utterly exhausted expressions on our faces. Finally, his gaze landed on me. He studied the faded hospital gown I was wearing, and the frayed second-hand charity blanket wrapped tightly around his great-grandson. The silence in the room was heavy, thick with an unspoken tension that made the air feel almost impossible to breathe. I expected him to criticize me, to tell me that this poverty was exactly what I deserved for choosing an unprofitable career as an artist and marrying a public school teacher instead of a wealthy businessman. I had braced myself for it. Instead, Harrison's face turned bright red with absolute fury. He raised his elegant cane and slammed it down hard against the linoleum floor with a resounding crack that echoed through the tiny room. "What on earth is this, Alyssa?" he demanded, his voice shaking the very walls around us. "Why are you sitting in this miserable, dilapidated place? Wasn't $250,000 a month enough for you to afford a private maternity suite at the best hospital in the state?" I froze completely. The words didn't make any sense to me whatsoever. I clutched my baby tighter, a cold sweat breaking out across the back of my neck. I looked at my grandfather in total shock, my voice barely a whisper when I finally managed to speak. "What, $250,000? I asked, staring at him as if he had completely lost his mind. "Grandpa, what are you talking about? I haven't received a single dollar from you or anyone else in this family since I was 18 years old. David and I have been scraping by entirely on our own for years." The fury instantly vanished from Harrison's face, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated horror. All the color drained from his cheeks, leaving him looking pale and suddenly every single bit of his 78 years. The silence returned, but this time it was absolutely deafening. He stared at me for a long moment, then turned sharply and walked out. The heavy wooden door clicked shut behind him, leaving David and me in a suffocating stillness. I looked down at Leo, still sleeping peacefully in his faded charity blanket, completely unaware that our entire reality had just fractured beneath us. David reached out and gently squeezed my shoulder, his hand trembling slightly against my hospital gown. Neither of us dared to speak. The phrase $250,000 a month echoed in my head like a skipping record. It was a number so astronomically large, it felt completely disconnected from the life we actually lived. We checked our bank accounts daily just to ensure we could afford basic groceries. We clipped coupons. We skipped meals. The idea that this kind of money existed, let alone that it somehow belonged to me, felt like a particularly cruel prank. 5 minutes later, the door swung open again. Harrison marched back in, his jaw set in a hard, unforgiving line. He held his smartphone out in front of him, speakerphone already activated. The crisp, professional voice of a woman cut through the tense air of the cramped maternity ward. Her name was Naomi, and Harrison introduced her as his lead forensic accountant. He ordered her to repeat exactly what she had just told him in the hallway, leaving out absolutely no details. Naomi took a measured breath, and the truth began to spill out, tearing down every lie my parents had ever built their lives upon. She explained that exactly 2 years ago, right around my 31st birthday, Harrison had established an irrevocable living trust entirely in my name. He had watched from afar as I struggled to build my independent illustration business, and he had wanted to ensure I never had to worry about basic survival again. The trust was specifically designed to cover my medical bills, my daily living expenses, and the operational costs of my creative work. It was fully funded and legally mandated to disperse exactly $250,000 into my personal accounts on the first of every single month. I felt the blood drain from my face. I gripped the edges of the hospital bed, trying to steady the sudden spinning of the room. David stepped forward, his voice tight with confusion, asking how it was possible that we had never seen a single dime, let alone received a notification from any bank. That was when Naomi revealed the fatal loophole. 2 years ago, Harrison had been diagnosed with a severe cardiac condition requiring him to remain entirely at his estate in Switzerland for specialized treatment and recovery. Because he was thousands of miles away and facing potential cognitive decline from his heavy medications, his legal team had advised him to appoint temporary stateside trustees to oversee the monthly disbursements until I turned 35. He chose the 2 people he assumed would naturally protect my best interests above all else. He appointed my parents, Richard and Patricia. They were given full administrative power to route the funds, sign the release documents, and oversee the transfer of money directly into my personal accounts. Harrison had explicitly, completely trusted them to take care of me. Instead, they had intercepted every single transfer. The sheer magnitude of the betrayal hit me like a physical blow to the chest. My mind immediately began doing the arithmetic. $250,000 a month. 12 months a year. 2 years. That was $6 million. $6 million of my money had simply vanished. A wave of sickening realization washed over me as the pieces of my family dynamic suddenly snapped together in perfect, horrifying clarity. For my entire life, I had been the designated family scapegoat. Richard and Patricia had never missed a single opportunity to belittle me for my choices. They constantly mocked my career as a freelance children's book illustrator, calling it a pathetic hobby that would never pay the bills. They treated David with open contempt, sneering at his job as a public school teacher and calling him a poor loser who couldn't provide for a family. When I was 18, they forced me out of the house with absolutely nothing, claiming I needed to learn the hard way how the real world worked. Meanwhile, they showered endless praise and lavish financial support on my younger sister Brittany, their golden child, a 30-year-old woman who had never held a real job in her entire life, yet somehow managed to live in absolute, unapologetic luxury. She spent her days shopping for designer clothes and bragging about her fabulous lifestyle on social media, projecting the image of someone born effortlessly to wealth. Her husband, Jamal, a man who confidently styled himself as a visionary tech entrepreneur, was the apple of my parents' eyes. Jamal was always pitching some new revolutionary app, always sporting flashy designer watches, and always treating David and me as though we were invisible, far beneath his notice. I remembered the humiliating family dinner just 3 months earlier. I was heavily pregnant, my back aching from taking on extra low-paying illustration commissions late into the night just to afford a second-hand crib. Brittany and Jamal had proudly announced the purchase of a sprawling multi-million-dollar waterfront mansion, bragging that Jamal's brilliant tech startup had just secured a massive wave of private seed funding. Richard and Patricia had practically beamed with pride, loudly comparing Jamal's incredible financial success to David's modest public school teacher salary. They had sat across from me at that dinner table watching me quietly eat in maternity clothes I had bought from a thrift store. They watched me discreetly wrap leftover dinner rolls in a napkin to take home for lunch the next day, and they had simply smiled. The truth was now glaringly obvious, burning brightly in the sterile hospital room. Jamal's sudden private tech funding was not from brilliant venture capitalists. Brittany's sprawling waterfront mansion was not bought with hard-earned corporate money. Their entire extravagant golden child lifestyle was a complete fabrication, funded entirely by intercepting the trust meant to protect my health and safety. I looked down at little Leo, gently tracing the edge of his faded yellow charity blanket. I thought about the severe panic attacks I had suffered during my 3rd trimester, lying awake at night, terrified that we wouldn't be able to afford his basic pediatric appointments. I thought about David taking on extra tutoring shifts and working late into the weekends, coming home so utterly exhausted he could barely stand, just to make sure we could pay our monthly heating bill. While we were literally counting loose change to survive the winter, my own parents were hoarding $6 million of my money. They had watched my husband break his back to provide for us, and they had watched their pregnant daughter suffer in near poverty, all so they could fund a life of extreme, unapologetic luxury for my sister and her arrogant husband. The deep sadness I had felt just moments ago completely evaporated, burned away instantly by a cold, burning rage that settled deep into my bones and hardened my resolve like steel. Before my grandfather could outline the legal steps ahead, the heavy hospital door flew open again with a jarring thud. My parents, Richard and Patricia, burst into the cramped room, breathless and looking completely frantic. It was obvious that one of Harrison's lawyers had tipped them off that he was in Seattle and had come straight to the hospital. They had clearly expected to arrive before my grandfather could uncover their massive financial theft, but the moment they saw the cold, furious expression on Harrison's face, they understood they were already too late. Rather than collapsing under guilt or showing even an ounce of remorse, my mother immediately launched an offense. Patricia was a master manipulator, and she unleashed a flawless, practiced act of toxic gaslighting right there in front of Harrison. She marched into the room pointing a trembling finger directly at me, her eyes wide with manufactured panic. "Dad, please. You cannot listen to a word she says," Patricia cried, her voice cracking with expert, practiced emotion. "Alyssa is suffering from severe postpartum depression. She is completely delusional and having a full mental breakdown. We sent her the trust fund money every single month, exactly as you instructed. We transferred all $250,000 into her joint account, but her deadbeat husband David gambled every last cent of it away on reckless investments. He blew through everything and they were bankrupting themselves. We had to temporarily cut off the funds to protect her and the baby from complete financial ruin." David stood up immediately, his face flushing with outrage at the blatant lie. He opened his mouth to defend himself, but Richard aggressively stepped forward, physically blocking him. "Keep your mouth shut, David," my father hissed, playing the role of the protective patriarch shielding his daughter from a predatory husband. "You have ruined my daughter's life. We stepped in as trustees to save our grandchild from living on the streets because of your gambling addiction. We did exactly what we had to do." I sat on the hospital bed clutching Leo tightly, absolutely stunned by the audacity of it all. They were standing in front of the man who had funded the trust, looking him dead in the eye, and accusing my hard-working, exhausted husband of gambling away $6 million. They were using the stigma of postpartum depression to completely invalidate my sanity and paint themselves as the noble saviors of a tragic situation. It was a sick, twisted performance designed purely to protect their stolen fortune. Just as the tension in the room reached a boiling point, the door opened again, and the golden couple strolled in. Brittany and Jamal entered the cramped, dingy public hospital room, looking as though they had just stepped off a red carpet at a luxury gala. Brittany was draped in designer labels, casually swinging a $10,000 Birkin bag on her arm. Jamal wore a custom-tailored Italian suit and a heavy gold Rolex watch that caught the harsh fluorescent overhead light and reflected it around the room in small, gleaming bursts. They walked in with the arrogant swagger of people who genuinely believed they owned the entire world, completely oblivious to the explosive confrontation unfolding around them. Jamal carelessly dropped a cheap, bruised $10 fruit basket wrapped in cellophane onto the small rolling table beside my bed. He looked around the depressing room, his lip curling in obvious disgust. Then he turned his full attention to David, puffed out his chest, and offered a slow, condescending smirk. "Man," Jamal said, shaking his head with exaggerated mock pity, "you really need to learn how to step up and provide for your family. Having your wife give birth in a place like this is just embarrassing. Look, if you're struggling this badly, you should have just called me. My tech startup is pulling in massive seed funding right now. If you need a small personal loan to keep the lights on, just ask. I'm always happy to help the less fortunate members of the family." Brittany giggled softly, leaning against Jamal's arm, looking at me with thinly veiled contempt dressed up as sympathy. "We would have brought a nicer gift," she said lightly, "but Mom told us you guys don't really have the space for anything nice in that tiny apartment of yours. Anyway, congratulations on the baby. Try not to stress too much, Alyssa. I know financial hardship can be really difficult on a new mother's mental health." They were standing there flaunting their extreme wealth and openly mocking our poverty, entirely unaware that the very foundation of their luxurious lifestyle was sitting right there in the room with them, watching, listening, saying nothing. They were bragging about the money they had stolen from the trust Harrison had created for me, performing their superiority as though their wealth were the well-earned result of their own brilliance and hustle. Jamal was literally wearing a watch purchased with money that was supposed to pay for my prenatal care. I looked at Harrison, expecting him to explode, but my grandfather remained completely and utterly silent. The red fury had left his face entirely, replaced by a terrifying, icy calm. He simply stood there leaning on his cane, his piercing blue eyes methodically analyzing every single person in the room. He let them dig their own graves with every word they spoke. He did not argue with Patricia. He did not defend David. He did not react to Jamal's arrogant performance. He simply looked at me, a cold, calculating intelligence shining behind those blue eyes. "I will handle this," Harrison said quietly. His voice was no longer booming, but it carried a lethal, settled weight that made the hairs on my arms rise. "Get some rest, Alyssa. We will speak very soon." Without another word to anyone else in the room, my grandfather turned and walked out, his bodyguards following closely behind. He left Richard and Patricia looking slightly confused, unsure whether their gaslighting had actually worked. They quickly ushered Brittany and Jamal out, throwing one last victorious, warning glare at David and me before the door clicked shut. I felt a surge of cautious hope, believing Harrison was going to immediately fix everything. But that night, as David went down to the hospital cafeteria to buy us a cheap sandwich, his debit card was declined. He checked our joint banking app and discovered that our only checking account, the one holding the meager savings we had scraped together for Leo's diapers and formula, had a balance of 0. The account had been completely frozen. Richard and Patricia, terrified of what Harrison was about to uncover, had used their remaining legal power as my trustees to strike first. They had contacted the bank, cited my supposed mental instability, and locked our joint account, deliberately cutting off our only financial lifeline to ensure we had nothing left to fight back with. The hospital discharged us the following morning. We brought Leo home to our cramped one-bedroom apartment where the heating pipes clanked loudly and the drafty windows did little to keep out the Seattle chill. David had to borrow $20 from a fellow teacher just to buy enough formula to get through the weekend. We were physically and emotionally decimated, clinging to each other on our worn-out sofa, praying that Harrison would call with a solution. Instead, the real nightmare began. Early Monday morning, a sharp, authoritative knock echoed through the apartment. David opened the door to find two stern-faced women standing in the hallway holding clipboards and flashing official state identification badges. They were from Child Protective Services. My heart dropped into my stomach. The lead agent stepped into our small living room, her eyes critically scanning the faded furniture, the cramped space, and the second-hand crib we had squeezed into the corner of our bedroom. She informed us they had received a highly credible, urgent tip from concerned family members. The report claimed I was suffering from severe, untreated postpartum psychosis. The anonymous tipsters, who were obviously my parents, stated that we were living in utter squalor, that we had 0 financial means to care for a newborn infant, and that Leo was in immediate, life-threatening danger. The agents demanded to inspect our kitchen. They opened our refrigerator, taking careful notes when they saw the nearly empty shelves. Because our accounts were frozen, we had barely any food left. They checked the temperature of the apartment, scrutinized the thrift store baby clothes, and interrogated David about his ability to provide a safe home environment. I sat on the edge of the sofa clutching Leo to my chest, trembling with a primal, suffocating terror. Richard and Patricia weren't just trying to silence me financially, they were actively trying to steal my newborn son. The agents informed us they were opening a formal, open-ended investigation and warned that any further signs of financial instability could result in Leo's immediate removal from our custody. They left us with a stack of intimidating legal pamphlets and a terrifying sense of impending doom hanging over every inch of our apartment. Barely 2 hours after the CPS agents walked out, another knock rattled our front door. This time, it was not a state worker. A sleek, imposing man in a custom-tailored Italian suit stood on our welcome mat, clutching a thick leather briefcase. He looked utterly out of place in our rundown apartment building hallway. He introduced himself as the senior litigation partner from a highly expensive corporate law firm representing Richard and Patricia. Without waiting for an invitation, he pushed his way into our living room and slapped a heavy stack of legal documents onto our cheap coffee table. "My clients are offering you a very generous lifeline, Alyssa," the lawyer said, his voice dripping with condescension as he adjusted his expensive silk tie. "They understand that you are unwell and that David is simply incapable of supporting a family on a public school teacher's salary. They are willing to make this entire investigation disappear, provided you sign these documents today." David picked up the contract, his hands shaking as he read through the stipulations. The blackmail was laid out with cold, calculating precision. If I signed the non-disclosure agreement, I would legally admit to suffering from severe financial incompetence and extreme mental instability. I would waive my right to ever contest the trust fund. And most horrifying of all, the contract demanded that David and I surrender temporary physical custody of Leo to my parents, so he could be raised in what they termed a proper, stable, wealthy environment. In exchange for signing away my soul and handing over my baby, Richard and Patricia would unfreeze our bank accounts and provide us with a meager allowance of $3,000 a month. "What happens if I refuse?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. The lawyer smiled, a slow, predatory, shark-like grin. "If you refuse, my clients will utilize their extensive network. Your father plays golf with the superintendent of the City Board of Education. By Friday, David will be terminated from his teaching position due to budget cuts. With no income, frozen bank accounts, and an active child endangerment investigation on record, the state will place your son in foster care by the end of the month. Sign the paper, Alyssa. You have absolutely no other choice." He extended an expensive fountain pen toward me, fully expecting me to break apart. He expected the fragile, beaten-down scapegoat to cry, to beg, to sign away her entire life just to survive. But I did not shed a single tear. I looked at David, who was holding Leo close against his chest, his eyes wide with exhaustion and barely contained fear. I looked at my beautiful, innocent son sleeping soundly despite the monsters conspiring to tear our small family apart. In that exact moment, a lifetime of enduring their emotional abuse, of accepting their scraps while Brittany lived like royalty on my stolen money, crystallized into a white-hot, diamond-hard fury. The scared, submissive daughter they had manipulated for 33 years died right there in that dingy living room. I stood up, picked up the thick stack of blackmail documents, and ripped them cleanly straight down the middle. The sharp sound of tearing paper rang out loudly in the small room. I threw the shredded pieces directly into the lawyer's chest, watching them scatter across his expensive suit and drift to the floor at his feet. "Get out of my house," I said, my voice resonating with a fierce, icy authority that startled even David. The lawyer scoffed, brushing a torn scrap of paper from his lapel. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life, little girl," he sneered. I took one deliberate step toward him, pointing toward the door. "Tell Richard and Patricia they picked the wrong fight," I said coldly. "Now get out before I call the police for trespassing." He held my gaze for a moment, then turned on his heel and slammed the door behind him. The moment the lock clicked into place, adrenaline surged through my veins like a current. I reached into the pocket of my jeans and pulled out the small embossed business card that Harrison's forensic accountant had quietly slipped into my hand back at the hospital. I grabbed my cell phone, punched in the secure number, and waited for Naomi to answer. We were going to war. The line rang only once. Naomi's voice was sharp, alert, and entirely professional. I told her everything. The frozen accounts, the CPS visit, the blackmail document the lawyer had just tried to force me to sign. Naomi was not surprised. She told me my parents were desperate, acting exactly like cornered animals who knew their financial crimes were about to be fully exposed. She instructed me to gather every piece of financial documentation, old mail, and tax return I possessed, and to meet her in 1 hour at a discreet location, a faded, neon-lit diner on the industrial outskirts of the city, far from the upscale neighborhoods where my parents' private investigators would be searching. I packed 2 heavy cardboard boxes with every financial record I had saved over the past 5 years, kissed David on the cheek, and slipped out through the building's basement exit. I navigated damp, trash-lined alleyways to avoid anyone watching the front entrance, then took 3 different buses to reach the diner, constantly checking over my shoulder. The diner smelled of stale coffee and fried grease, nearly empty save for a tired waitress and a truck driver in the corner. Naomi was already waiting in a dimly lit booth at the very back, a thick leather briefcase resting on the cracked vinyl seat beside her. I slid in across from her and pushed my heavy boxes across the sticky tabletop. Naomi ordered us 2 black coffees, then opened her briefcase and laid out a stack of heavily redacted bank statements and wire transfer logs that Harrison had authorized her to access. She looked me directly in the eye and delivered a reality check that fundamentally shifted the entire landscape of our battle. Richard and Patricia didn't just spend your trust fund on luxury vacations and designer handbags, Naomi said, her voice low and precise. They constructed a highly sophisticated money laundering network. Because the trust was legally bound to your name and social security number, they couldn't simply wire $250,000 a month into their personal checking accounts. A direct transfer of that magnitude would have immediately triggered massive red flags with the IRS and federal banking regulators, initiating a full-scale audit within weeks. She spread a complex flowchart across the table, the trust fund at the top, with dozens of arrows branching toward shell companies, fraudulent consulting fees, and offshore holding accounts. To access your money without triggering criminal exposure, they had to make the disbursements appear as legitimate business investments and medical expenses. They created an intricate network to launder the funds before the money ever reached their own pockets, or the pockets of your sister and her husband. But to authorize these massive, complicated transfers, they needed one crucial element: your explicit legal consent on federal documents. I shook my head, confusion battling with the mounting fury inside me. I never consented to anything. I've never seen these documents. I've never even heard of these shell companies. That is exactly why I asked you to bring your old mail, Naomi said, gesturing to the cardboard boxes I had dragged across the city. We need to cross-reference what the trust sent out against what you actually received at your apartment. We spent the next 3 hours turning that dingy diner booth into a makeshift forensic accounting war room. We spread my meager tax returns, old utility bills, and bank statements across the table, comparing them side by side with the official trust disbursement logs Naomi had pulled from Harrison's legal team. The timeline we uncovered was absolutely damning. Every single time a major transfer was authorized from the trust, there was a corresponding gap in my personal mail. The realization hit me like ice water. My parents had actively intercepted my mail for 2 straight years. Using their knowledge of my previous addresses and their power as trustees, they had redirected every crucial financial document away from my mailbox and straight into their own hands. They had placed a ghost lock on my financial identity, invisible, systematic, and utterly deliberate. Then, Naomi pulled out a series of federal tax authorization forms submitted over the past 2 years. These forms legally approved the transfer of millions of dollars out of the trust to sidestep immediate taxation penalties. At the bottom of each page was a signature that spelled out my name. I stared at the dark blue ink, my blood running ice cold. The signature was a decent imitation, clearly practiced, carefully rehearsed, but I knew immediately it was not mine. The loop on the A was entirely wrong, and the slant of the letters was far too aggressive. It was an arrogant, careless forgery. "They forged my signature," I whispered, tracing the fake handwriting with a trembling finger. My own parents had forged my signature on federal tax documents while I was struggling to buy groceries for my family. Naomi nodded, her expression grim but quietly triumphant. "Yes, they did. And that changes absolutely everything, Alyssa. They thought they were simply stealing from a daughter they considered too weak and too broken to ever fight back. But by signing your name on these specific forms to bypass the trust restrictions, they committed massive federal crimes. This is no longer a civil dispute over a mishandled family trust fund. They have engaged in identity theft, wire fraud, and tax evasion." The harsh fluorescent lights of the diner flickered overhead as Naomi's words settled over me like a heavy lead weight. Identity theft, wire fraud, tax evasion. The sheer scale of what my parents had so deliberately orchestrated was almost too enormous to fully comprehend. I looked down at the forged signature on the federal tax authorization form, my stomach churning with a mixture of profound disgust and rising adrenaline. I took a slow, measured breath to steady my racing heart. Then I looked back across the sticky vinyl table at Naomi and asked her to show me exactly where those $6 million had gone. Naomi nodded, her expression entirely focused. She reached back into her thick leather briefcase and pulled out a fresh stack of heavily redacted banking traces and corporate registry documents. She explained that Richard and Patricia had been incredibly careful never to let the stolen funds directly touch their personal checking accounts. They knew that a sudden, unexplained influx of $250,000 a month would immediately alert federal banking regulators and trigger a full-scale audit within weeks. Instead, they had employed a classic corporate shell game. The money was routed through a series of temporary holding accounts before being permanently deposited into a single corporate bank account belonging to a limited liability company registered in Delaware. Naomi slid the corporate charter across the sticky tabletop, pressing the tip of her pen to the bold text printed at the very top of the page. The name of the company stared back at me in stark black ink. Apex Innovations. The name hit me with the force of a freight train. I gasped, pressing both hands against my mouth as a sickening wave of absolute clarity washed over me. Apex Innovations was not just a random string of corporate buzzwords. It was the exact name of my brother-in-law Jamal's so-called revolutionary tech startup. For the past 2 years, Jamal had been parading around Seattle high society, loudly positioning himself as a brilliant, self-made tech visionary. He rented premium glass-walled office space in the most expensive tech corridor in the city. He regularly hosted lavish networking events, throwing thousands of dollars at open bars to impress high-profile venture capitalists and local politicians. He constantly bragged at family dinners about how his groundbreaking software platform had secured massive seed funding from exclusive angel investors. He had treated David and me with utter, open contempt at every opportunity, sneering at our modest income as though our poverty were a personal character flaw. Now, sitting in this dingy diner booth under flickering fluorescent lights, the horrifying reality of Jamal's tech empire was laid entirely bare. There were no exclusive angel investors. There was no brilliant software platform. The company had zero actual products and absolutely zero legitimate corporate revenue. The entire operation was a massive, hollow facade constructed with deliberate precision. The private seed funding Jamal loved to brag about so loudly was nothing more than the stolen money from my medical and living trust fund. My parents had effectively bankrolled his arrogant, lavish lifestyle using the exact funds intended to keep my newborn son safe, warm, and fed. Jamal was wearing tailored Italian suits and driving luxury sports cars that had been paid for with money I desperately needed to cover my hospital bills. I explained everything I knew about Jamal's public persona and his fraudulent company to Naomi, detailing it methodically. She listened intently, jotting rapid notes on a yellow legal pad. When I finished detailing the waterfront mansion, the exotic cars, and the extravagant corporate launch parties, Naomi's eyes gleamed with the sharp, predatory focus of a forensic accountant who has just found the undeniable golden thread. She leaned forward, resting her forearms on the table, and explained the full, crushing gravity of the situation. "This changes the entire battle plan, Alyssa," she said, her voice dropping to a serious, hushed tone. "This is no longer a messy civil dispute over a mishandled family trust. What your parents and Jamal have done crosses multiple clear lines into severe federal criminality." Naomi pointed to the routing numbers on the bank transfer logs. "By physically wiring millions of dollars of stolen trust funds across state lines into a fraudulent corporate entity using your forged signature, Richard and Patricia have committed undeniable federal wire fraud. The penalties for wire fraud at this financial magnitude are nothing short of astronomical." She paused, letting that land. "But the situation with Jamal is actually significantly worse." She pulled out a blank sheet of paper and began sketching a quick diagram to illustrate the legal trap my family had so expertly and so blindly constructed for themselves. Jamal has been using Apex Innovations as a massive personal slush fund. He is taking stolen money, claiming it as legitimate corporate investment capital, and then using those funds to purchase personal luxury assets: his waterfront mansion, his fleet of high-end vehicles, his designer wardrobe. By doing this, he is deliberately commingling stolen personal funds with corporate assets. To maintain the convincing illusion of a functioning tech company, he has almost certainly filed corporate tax returns claiming these stolen funds as legitimate business revenue. Naomi looked me dead in the eye, her expression absolutely deadly serious. "That constitutes deliberate large-scale tax evasion and federal money laundering. The local police department and family court judges do not handle crimes of this magnitude or complexity. The IRS Criminal Investigation Division and the FBI will now have primary jurisdiction over this entire case. The moment we hand over these documents, the federal government steps in, and your family will face the full, crushing weight of the United States justice system." I sat back slowly against the cracked vinyl of the diner booth, absorbing the sheer magnitude of everything Naomi had just laid out. My parents had believed they were constructing an unbreakable financial fortress, a system sophisticated enough to keep them wealthy and keep me permanently trapped in poverty. But in their greedy, reckless rush to fund Jamal's fake tech empire, they had walked straight into a federal trap. They had handed me the exact weapon I needed to dismantle everything they had built. The fear that had gripped me all morning completely evaporated, replaced by a cold, calculating determination that settled deep into my chest like iron. I looked at the corporate charter one final time, fully and completely ready to tear my toxic family down to the ground once and for all. I pushed the corporate charter back across the sticky diner table, my mind racing with the sheer scale of the deception that had been operating around me for 2 full years. I asked Naomi to dig deeper, into the actual state filings for Apex Innovations. I needed to see the foundational paperwork, the original documents that had breathed legal life into this fraudulent company. Naomi nodded and turned her laptop toward me, her fingers moving quickly across the keyboard as she accessed a secure database containing the Delaware Corporate Registry and the IRS Employer Identification Number applications. She pulled up the scanned digital copies of the original incorporation papers and the bank mandate cards used to open the corporate accounts. The very documents that had established Apex Innovations as a legal entity capable of receiving the millions of dollars siphoned from my trust. I leaned close to the glowing screen, my eyes scanning the dense legal jargon until I reached the bottom of the pages, where the primary signatures and the handwritten contact information were located. I had already identified in the earlier documents that my own signature had been forged to release the trust funds. But looking at these specific corporate filings, something else immediately caught my attention. It was the handwritten printed text filling in the corporate addresses, the contact details, and the dates penned next to the signatures. I stared at the looping, distinctive letter forms, the sharp, aggressive slant of the capital A, and the bubbly, almost juvenile loops on the lowercase y. A cold shock of recognition hit me so hard it physically stole the breath right out of my lungs. "That is not my mother's handwriting," I whispered, pressing a trembling finger to the screen. "And it is absolutely not my father's." Naomi looked at me, her brow furrowed. "Then whose is it?" "It's Brittany's," I said, the full, horrific realization crystallizing completely in my mind. "My sister wrote this. She is the one who forged my signature on the trust release forms, and she is the one who physically filled out these federal corporate documents." Naomi quickly zoomed in on the handwriting samples, her professional composure breaking for a fraction of a second. "Are you absolutely certain, Alyssa? In a federal court, handwriting analysis will be front and center. There is no room for doubt." "I am completely positive," I replied without a single hesitation or shred of uncertainty. Growing up, I was the family scapegoat. But I was also the one constantly forced to do Brittany's homework and cover up her careless mistakes for years. I know her handwriting better than I know my own. As I spoke the words aloud, the true, sickening logic of my toxic family's dynamic snapped into perfect, horrible focus. Richard and Patricia were the calculating masterminds who had planned the entire $6 million embezzlement scheme from the very beginning. They had manipulated the trust structure, orchestrated the money laundering network, and directed every flow of stolen cash with surgical precision. But to keep their own hands entirely clean from federal tax liability and forgery charges, to ensure no forensic trail led back to them personally, they had used their golden child. They had convinced Brittany to physically sign the forged documents. If the scheme ever unraveled and the FBI came knocking, handwriting experts would trace the felony directly back to Brittany, never to Richard or Patricia. They had deliberately turned their own favorite daughter into a federal felon, purely to protect themselves. But the depths of their depravity did not stop even there. Naomi pulled up the ultimate ownership structure of Apex Innovations and highlighted the section detailing the executive hierarchy of the LLC. "Look at this," Naomi said, her voice laced with quiet, controlled disgust. "Richard and Patricia hold 0 legal titles within this company. Brittany also holds 0 legal titles. Jamal is listed as the sole managing member and the exclusive registered tax agent for Apex Innovations." I stared at Jamal's name printed in bold black letters, and suddenly the entire awful puzzle was perfectly and completely assembled. Jamal was a charismatic, deeply arrogant man who lived and breathed the performance of his own genius. And my parents had played his massive ego with absolute expert precision. They had pumped him full of hollow praise, funding his lavish lifestyle, his luxury cars, and his waterfront mansion entirely with my stolen money. They made him the public face of the company. They let him parade around Seattle high society as a self-made tech mogul, basking in the admiration and the envy of everyone around him. But in the cold, unforgiving eyes of the federal government, Jamal was not a genius CEO. He was the designated scapegoat. Jamal is the only individual legally responsible for every single dollar flowing in and out of that corporate shell, Naomi confirmed, her voice steady and precise. If the IRS audits Apex Innovations, they will not pursue your parents. They will go directly after the registered managing member who claimed stolen funds as corporate revenue and systematically failed to pay federal taxes on it. Your parents engineered this entire corporate structure so that Jamal would absorb the ultimate fall. He is looking at 15 years in a federal penitentiary for large-scale tax evasion. Brittany will face federal time for the forgery. And Richard and Patricia plan to walk away completely untouched, claiming they were nothing more than innocent victims of their own children's reckless financial misconduct. I sat back against the diner booth, completely breathless at the sheer, unadulterated evil my own parents had so patiently and deliberately constructed. They were willing to sacrifice their golden child. They were prepared to send their own son-in-law to federal prison for 15 years. All of it, simply to protect their wealth and preserve their pristine, impeccable reputation. Jamal has absolutely no idea, I said quietly, a slow, dangerous smile creeping across my face despite everything. He genuinely believes Richard and Patricia respect him. He thinks he is a self-made success story. He has absolutely no clue they deliberately set him up to absorb a 15-year federal prison sentence so they could pocket $6 million and walk away free. Naomi closed her laptop with a quiet, deliberate click, her eyes locking onto mine with absolute focus. Knowledge is power, Alyssa. The only question now is what exactly you are going to do with it. I looked out the rain-streaked diner window at the cold, relentless Seattle downpour soaking the empty street outside. For 33 years, I had been their victim. They had expected me to break down, to sob, to sign their blackmail documents out of sheer desperation and exhaustion. They had expected the scapegoat to quietly disappear. But they had made one fatal, catastrophic miscalculation. I am not simply going to hand this over to the police and walk away, I told Naomi, my voice ringing with a cold, settled certainty I had never felt before in my entire life. If I do that right now, Richard and Patricia will immediately retain high-powered attorneys and spend every resource they have spinning the narrative. They will claim ignorance. They will claim they were deceived. No. I paused, feeling the shape of the plan crystallize clearly in my mind. I am going to use Jamal's ego and my parents' own profound arrogance against them. I am going to let them tear each other apart completely from the inside out. We are going to build a trap, and we are going to make absolutely certain every single one of them walks directly into it. I left the diner with a fire burning in my veins that I had never once felt before in my life. Naomi and I finalized our full strategy before parting ways in the cold rain. We needed one final, undeniable piece of evidence. Paper trails and forged signatures were powerful, devastatingly so. But to truly nail them to the wall and ensure there was absolutely zero plausible deniability remaining, we needed a recorded admission. We needed them to confirm their control over my finances and their deliberate, malicious intent on tape, in their own voices, in their own words. I rushed back to our cramped apartment, my mind calculating and recalculating every single word I was about to say. David was pacing the small living room with Leo asleep against his chest, his expression tight with worry. I quickly briefed him on everything Naomi had uncovered, watching his face shift in real time from deep exhaustion to absolute, barely contained outrage as I explained the full scope of the $6 million embezzlement and the fraudulent tech company built entirely on my stolen funds. I told him we had to play along for just a few more days. He closed his eyes for a long moment, then nodded once. Slowly, firmly. I set up my laptop on our scratched kitchen table, connected a high-quality external microphone, and opened a secure audio recording program. I took a long, slow breath, closed my eyes, and deliberately channeled every ounce of the genuine terror and despair I had felt over the past 48 hours. I needed to give the performance of a lifetime. I had to become the broken, pathetic, defeated victim they so desperately wanted me to be. I hit record and dialed my mother's number. The phone rang 4 long times. I knew Patricia was staring at the caller ID, making me wait deliberately, letting me sweat and suffer and doubt myself. Finally, she answered with a sharp, impatient tone, asking curtly what I wanted. I did not speak immediately. Instead, I let out a ragged, trembling sob. I forced my voice to crack and splinter, sounding completely devastated and utterly crushed. "Mom, please," I cried softly into the receiver, making certain the microphone caught every pathetic, hitching breath. "Please, you have to help me. I am so sorry. You were right about everything." I heard a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line, then a slow, immensely satisfied exhale. Patricia was absolutely drinking every syllable in, savoring it. I continued pouring on the desperation. I told her we had no money left for groceries. I told her the apartment was freezing and that Leo was crying because we couldn't afford to turn the heat up. I threw myself completely on my sword, sobbing that I was a massive, pathetic failure. I choked out the exact words I knew she had been waiting 33 years to hear. I admitted that my freelance illustration career was a hopeless joke. I agreed with her fabricated story, crying that David was useless and utterly incapable of providing for his family. I begged her to unfreeze the bank accounts, promising desperately that I would sign whatever legal documents her lawyer had brought over. I told her I would do absolutely anything she wanted if she would just give us enough money to survive the week. Patricia did not offer a single syllable of maternal comfort. There was no warmth for her freezing, starving grandson. Instead, her voice dripped with slow, arrogant, vindictive pleasure. She was completely drunk on power, entirely convinced she had finally, completely broken her stubborn, rebellious daughter after all these years. "I told you this would happen, Alyssa," she gloated, her words saturated with poison. "I warned you for years that playing artist would leave you destitute. You made your bed with that public school teacher, and now here you are, begging me to save you from the consequences of your own stupidity." I whimpered into the phone, apologizing repeatedly, carefully inflating her ego with every single word. I knew precisely how narcissists operated. Feed their superiority complex sufficiently, and they become reckless. They start talking. They start confessing. I asked her what I needed to do to make things right, begging for just a small fraction of the trust fund money to cover our rent. Patricia laughed. It was a cold, cruel, hollow sound that vibrated right through the speaker. "You think you can just cry and I will hand you a check?" she sneered. "You need to learn how the real world works, Alyssa. You need to understand your place in this family. If you want a handout, you are going to have to earn it. You are going to have to learn some real humility first." She then laid out her grand, elaborate plan with obvious relish. She informed me that this coming Saturday night, Brittany and Jamal were hosting a massive, highly exclusive housewarming and tech launch gala at their new waterfront mansion. She bragged that all of Jamal's elite venture capitalist connections, local politicians, and high society influencers would be in attendance. Patricia told me that if I wanted her to authorize a temporary release of funds to keep my child from going hungry, I had to attend the gala. "But you are not coming as a guest," Patricia stated flatly, her voice hardening with malicious glee. "You will arrive 2 hours early. You will enter through the catering door at the back of the house. I have already spoken with the event coordinator. You will be given a uniform and you will help the waitstaff serve champagne and hors d'oeuvres to Jamal's investors. You are going to serve your highly successful sister and her brilliant husband. You are going to stand there and look at what real success looks like, and then you are going to serve them their drinks. Maybe then you will finally understand in your bones exactly how much of a failure you truly are." The sheer, breathtaking cruelty of the demand hung in the air of our small kitchen. My own mother was forcing me to work as a servant at a party funded entirely by the $6 million she had stolen from my medical trust. She wanted to humiliate me in front of Seattle high society, to physically, publicly parade my manufactured poverty against Brittany's stolen luxury. She wanted to shatter my spirit in front of a live, admiring audience. She wanted a spectacle. I let out one final broken sob into the phone receiver. I made my voice sound small, utterly crushed, and entirely submissive. "Okay, Mom," I whispered meekly. "I will do it. I will come to the catering door. I will wear the uniform and serve the drinks. Please. Just promise you will help us once the party is over." "I promise nothing until I see how well you follow direction," Patricia snapped. "Do not be late, Alyssa, and do not embarrass us." The line went dead. I lowered the phone slowly from my ear. I reached across the table and clicked the stop button on the audio recording software, watching the waveform freeze on the screen as the crystal-clear digital file saved automatically to a secure cloud server. The sound of my manufactured sobbing disappeared from the room instantly, as though it had never existed. David walked over quietly and placed both hands on my shoulders, his eyes fixed on the saved audio file glowing on the screen. I looked up at him, my face completely dry, my expression calm and steady. I stared at the recording interface for a long, silent moment, and a slow, ice-cold smile spread across my face. They had taken the bait completely. The trap was set. The stage was perfectly and irrevocably primed for their absolute destruction. Early the next morning, David and I arrived at a towering glass-walled high-rise in the center of downtown Seattle. My grandfather Harrison had secured an entire floor for his legal team, converting the sleek corporate boardroom into what amounted to a heavily fortified command center. The contrast between this immaculate, climate-controlled environment and our drafty, cramped apartment was staggering, but I barely registered the luxury around me. My focus was entirely locked on the battle ahead. Harrison was already seated at the head of the massive mahogany conference table, his cane resting against his chair, his expression as hard and unyielding as granite. Naomi sat to his right, her laptop open and connected to the room's main projector screen, files and transfer logs already populating the display. Flanking them were three men in sharp, deliberately understated suits. They did not carry themselves like corporate attorneys. Their posture was rigid and controlled, their eyes cataloging every detail of the room with practiced professional intensity. Harrison introduced them calmly. Special Agent Carter from the FBI's White-Collar Crime Division, Supervisory Agent Miller from the IRS Criminal Investigation Unit, and an Assistant United States Attorney. Naomi's meticulous documentation, the money laundering network, the forged federal tax forms, the fraudulent corporate structure of Apex Innovations, had been handed over to federal authorities late the previous night. The response had been immediate and overwhelming. Agent Carter leaned forward, resting his hands flat on the polished table. He informed us that the sheer scale of the embezzlement, combined with the interstate wire transfers and the blatant forgery of federal tax documents, had triggered an immediate federal response requiring no further deliberation. The $6 million theft had elevated the situation far beyond any standard financial dispute. "We spent the last 12 hours verifying the forensic accounting files your team provided," he said. "Alyssa, the evidence of wire fraud and identity theft is entirely undeniable. Based on these findings, a federal judge has already signed sealed arrest warrants for Richard, Patricia, and Brittany." I felt David's hand grip mine tightly beneath the table. Arrest warrants. The concrete, irreversible reality of what was about to happen settled over me like a physical weight. My parents and my sister were going to federal prison. There would be no quiet settlements, no slaps on the wrist, no last-minute legal maneuvering that made it all disappear. They had crossed a line that simply could not be uncrossed. Agent Miller from the IRS intervened at that point, his expression growing noticeably more serious. "While we have the warrants for the individuals, the corporate side of this investigation, specifically Jamal and Apex Innovations, presents a significant tactical challenge. Jamal is currently the sole legal managing member of a shell company holding millions in stolen assets. He has almost certainly filed fraudulent corporate tax returns to maintain the illusion of an operating tech startup. Agent Miller paused. To fully prosecute Jamal for large-scale tax evasion, and to ensure we can seize and recover the remaining stolen trust funds before they can be wired to offshore accounts, we need complete, unimpeded access to his corporate servers, his personal laptops, and all digital assets currently located inside that waterfront mansion. The problem, Agent Carter added, is that Jamal presents himself publicly as a sophisticated tech CEO. If we simply breach the front door with a standard raid, he will almost certainly trigger remote wipe protocols or physically destroy critical hard drives before we can secure the building. The digital evidence of the money laundering and the fraudulent corporate revenue must be preserved completely intact. We need to physically secure the devices before he has any indication whatsoever that he is under federal investigation. This was precisely where my role in the entire operation became absolutely vital. The gala that Patricia had so viciously, so gleefully ordered me to attend as a servant was the perfect cover. The mansion would be filled with over 150 guests, catering staff, and event personnel moving constantly through every room. It was exactly the kind of high-volume, high-distraction environment federal agents could exploit with surgical precision. The strategy was outlined with military-grade clarity. The FBI and IRS had already quietly intercepted and briefed the catering company hired for the event. Several undercover federal agents would infiltrate the gala positioned as waitstaff, bartenders, and security personnel. A separate team of agents dressed in expensive, well-fitted suits would blend seamlessly into the crowd, presenting themselves as prospective venture capitalists with interest in Jamal's fake startup. "Your role is specific, Alyssa," the Assistant United States Attorney said, looking directly at me with steady, unwavering eyes. "You are the bait. You need to keep Richard, Patricia, Brittany, and, above all, Jamal completely focused and distracted. We need them talking. We need them boasting about their wealth, their success, their unassailable superiority. The more they concentrate on publicly humiliating you, the less attention they will pay to the catering staff moving quietly and methodically through the house." Agent Carter outlined the precise timeline. While I was absorbing their narcissistic cruelty in the main hall, the undercover agents positioned as catering staff would quietly secure the perimeter and locate Jamal's private home office. The agents posing as investors would keep Jamal's associates and business contacts fully occupied. The moment the cyber team confirmed physical control of Jamal's laptops and the mansion's server room, they would transmit the signal to the strike team staged outside. "You must not break character under any circumstances, Alyssa," Naomi warned, her voice filled with quiet but urgent concern. "They expect you to be broken, submissive, and desperately grateful for any scraps of approval they offer. If you show even the slightest flicker of defiance, if you betray even for 1 second that you know what is coming, Patricia will sense it immediately. She will panic, and she may alert Jamal. You have to absorb every single thing they throw at you, completely and convincingly, until the signal is given." I looked slowly around the room, at the federal agents, at Naomi, at my grandfather sitting silent and iron still at the head of the table, and finally at my husband, whose eyes were steady and full of a quiet, fierce pride I had never seen directed at me so clearly before. I thought about the primal terror that had coursed through me when Child Protective Services knocked on our apartment door. I thought about the cold, calculated cruelty of Patricia ordering me to enter through the catering entrance and serve champagne to the very people living off my stolen money. I thought about $6 million, stripped away dollar by dollar while my newborn son slept in a charity blanket in a public hospital ward. "I will not break character," I said, my voice settling into a calm, absolute certainty that seemed to quiet the entire room. "I will let them tear me down in front of every one of their elite guests. I will let them brag about every stolen dollar. I will give them exactly the pathetic defeated victim they have spent 33 years trying to create, right up until the moment you put the handcuffs on them. The trap was flawlessly set. The federal warrants were signed and sealed. The undercover agents were fully briefed and in position. And I was ready, completely, coldly, irreversibly ready, to walk directly into the lion's den and let my toxic family construct, with their own arrogant hands, their own spectacular and very public execution. Saturday night arrived wrapped in a chilling, torrential downpour that felt entirely appropriate for the storm I was about to unleash on everyone sheltering inside that mansion. I pulled my battered 12-year-old sedan up to the towering wrought iron gates of Brittany and Jamal's brand new $8 million waterfront estate. The sheer, almost obscene scale of the property hit me like a blow to the chest. It sat on a prime stretch of Seattle waterfront real estate, a massive, modern fortress of steel and floor-to-ceiling glass panels overlooking the dark, churning waters of Puget Sound. The sprawling circular driveway was already packed densely with exotic vehicles. Gleaming red Ferraris, sleek silver Porsches, and custom matte black SUVs lined the rain-slicked cobblestone path leading to the grand entrance. A team of valet drivers in crisp, matching uniforms hurried through the downpour, their eyes widening in undisguised confusion as my rusted, rattling car crept up toward the entrance. I did not hand them my keys. Instead, I drove slowly past the grand front entrance and parked near the side delivery lane, exactly where my mother had coldly instructed me to go. I turned off the ignition and looked down at my outfit in the dim glow of the dashboard. I had chosen deliberately and carefully. I was wearing the absolute worst clothes in my entire closet. An oversized, aggressively faded gray sweater beginning to unravel at both cuffs, paired with cheap, ill-fitting denim jeans and scuffed canvas sneakers that had seen far better years. I looked like exactly what they believed me to be. I stepped out into the cold rain, let it soak into my shoulders for a moment, and walked toward the catering door at the back of the mansion. The trap was ready. The players were all in position. And I was done being anyone's victim. I looked completely destitute, a stark, jarring, almost surreal contrast to the extreme wealth radiating from every surface of the mansion surrounding me. I took a deep, steadying breath, feeling the small, cold square of the Federal Wire transmitter securely taped flat against my ribs beneath my heavy sweater. Every arrogant boast, every cruel insult, every careless confession would be broadcast in real time directly to the federal agents waiting in the command van parked just 2 blocks away on the rain-soaked street. I opened the car door, stepped out into the freezing downpour, and walked toward the catering entrance at the back of the massive estate. The mansion's industrial-sized kitchen was a whirlwind of organized chaos. Professional caterers rushed past me carrying gleaming silver platters loaded with caviar blinis and shaved black truffles. I immediately made eye contact with 2 members of the catering staff. One was methodically wiping down a stainless steel counter. The other was precisely arranging folded cocktail napkins into a geometric fan. They each gave me a barely perceptible, single nod. They were undercover federal agents, already perfectly and invisibly positioned inside the house. Before I could even reach for an apron, the heavy swinging doors leading to the main dining hall burst open with a dramatic crack. My sister Brittany marched into the kitchen looking as though she had just stepped directly off a Paris runway. She was draped in a breathtaking, custom-fitted $15,000 couture gown that shimmered and caught the harsh kitchen lighting with every precise movement. Diamonds blazed at her throat and both wrists. When her eyes landed on me, on my faded, unraveling sweater and my scuffed canvas sneakers, a look of profound, venomous disgust twisted her perfectly contoured face into something ugly. She did not say hello. She did not ask about her newborn nephew, who had been sleeping in a second-hand charity blanket just days earlier. She simply marched directly up to me, grabbed a heavy silver tray loaded with crystal champagne flutes, and shoved it roughly and deliberately into my hands. "Do not drop these, Alyssa," Brittany sneered, her voice ringing loudly over the clatter and bustle of the surrounding kitchen staff, ensuring maximum audience. "One of those glasses costs more than your husband makes in a full month. I do not want your poverty rubbing off on my guests. Get out there, serve the drinks, and stay completely silent unless someone speaks to you first. Do you understand me?" I gripped the edges of the heavy silver tray, forcing my shoulders to slump in an exaggerated, convincing display of submissive defeat. I looked down at the polished kitchen floor and offered a meek, barely audible response. "I will be very careful, Brittany," I whispered. She rolled her eyes, scoffed loudly enough for the entire kitchen staff to hear, and spun on her heel, her expensive gown swishing dramatically as she disappeared back through the swinging doors into the party beyond. The moment the doors sealed shut behind her, the undercover agent at the stainless steel counter shot me a single, fierce look of pure solidarity. I straightened my posture, drew one slow, controlled breath, and pushed through the swinging doors into the lion's den. The main foyer of the mansion was absolutely breathtaking in its obscenity. Imported white marble floors stretched from wall to wall. An enormous custom crystal chandelier hung like a frozen explosion of light from the vaulted ceiling above. Floor-to-ceiling panoramic windows offered sweeping views of the dark, churning waters of Puget Sound below, the surface broken into fragments of reflected light by the ongoing downpour. The room was packed shoulder to shoulder with over 150 of Seattle's most powerful citizens, local politicians, high-profile venture capitalists, tech investors, prominent socialites, all mingling and murmuring to the refined sound of a live string quartet stationed in the far corner. I kept my head bowed, moving silently through the crowd and offering champagne to people who did not bother to acknowledge my existence. I was entirely invisible to them, nothing more than part of the hired help, a forgettable figure in a faded sweater carrying a tray. But I was sharply, deliberately visible to my family. Throughout the first full hour of the gala, Richard and Patricia paraded through the room like visiting royalty on a royal tour. They circled group after group of wealthy older men, loudly introducing Jamal with manufactured reverence, heaping praise onto his fraudulent tech startup, calling him a brilliant, self-made visionary with an unprecedented eye for disruption. Jamal absorbed every syllable of their adulation, swirling his glass of expensive bourbon and bragging without restraint about how his unparalleled hustle and grind had secured his monumental seed funding. He performed the role of the triumphant African-American tech entrepreneur with polished, practiced charisma, completely and utterly unaware that the in-laws who worshipped him so openly had meticulously and deliberately positioned him to absorb the full crushing weight of a federal prison sentence. Every single time my parents guided a cluster of investors past the marble pillar where I stood, they raised their voices slightly, just enough to ensure I heard every syllable of their manufactured narrative. "Oh, that is just the hired help," Patricia laughed lightly as a local politician glanced briefly in my direction. "A tragic situation, really. She is our eldest daughter, our great disappointment. We offered her every possible advantage in life, but she simply refused to apply herself. Now she is reduced to serving drinks at her younger sister's mansion just to cover her rent. It simply breaks a mother's heart to watch." Richard chimed in immediately, clapping Jamal warmly on the shoulder. "It just goes to show, you cannot force ambition into someone who refuses to want more for themselves. Thank God we have Jamal and Brittany to carry the real legacy forward. They understand what it actually takes to build something lasting and magnificent." I stood quietly against the cool marble wall, holding my silver tray with both hands, my expression fixed in humble, humiliated submission. I did not flinch. I did not answer back. I simply offered them a weak, defeated nod. The perfect, compliant performance of the broken scapegoat they had spent 33 years trying to create. But beneath my faded, oversized sweater, the hidden wire microphone was capturing every defamatory word with perfect, crystalline clarity. The federal agents monitoring from the van 2 blocks away were receiving pristine audio of Richard and Patricia publicly and explicitly claiming ownership of this fraudulent empire, and tying Jamal directly and irrevocably to the shell company that had received every stolen dollar. My family was so completely intoxicated by their own power, so utterly convinced of their own invincibility, that they were happily and enthusiastically testifying against themselves on a federal wiretap. I lowered my eyes just in time to conceal the cold, predatory smile that threatened to surface and break my entire performance. The hum of the lavish party swelled around me as waiters continued to circulate with expensive hors d'oeuvres and crystal flutes of vintage champagne. I remained perfectly still against the cool marble pillar, holding my silver tray, breathing slowly and evenly. The tiny microphone taped flat against my ribs captured every sound in the massive foyer, every whispered conversation, every self-congratulatory toast, every arrogant confession dressed up as small talk. Then the sharp, unmistakable sound of a silver spoon tapping deliberately against crystal cut clean through the ambient noise of the party. Jamal stood at the very center of the grand sweeping staircase, elevated above the assembled crowd, looking down at his sea of carefully cultivated wealthy admirers. He raised his glass high, a smug, deeply self-satisfied grin spreading across his face. The string quartet stopped playing mid-phrase. 150 elite guests turned in unison toward the man of the hour, their faces expectant and admiring. "Thank you all so much for coming out tonight to celebrate this extraordinary milestone," Jamal projected, his voice saturated with unearned theatrical confidence. "When I first started building Apex Innovations, people told me I was crazy. They told me the market was too saturated, that the tech landscape was too brutally competitive, that someone like me didn't stand a chance. But I knew exactly what I brought to the table. I knew my vision was going to fundamentally disrupt the entire industry." He paused, letting the crowd murmur their appreciative agreement, soaking their admiration in like dry earth absorbing rain. He adjusted the lapel of his tailored Italian jacket with practiced nonchalance and continued. "It takes a relentless, unforgiving grind to reach this level. It takes pure, unadulterated hustle and the willingness to sacrifice everything for your dream. I built this company from complete and total scratch. I spent countless sleepless nights writing code in empty rooms, pitching to skeptical audiences, grinding away when every rational voice around me said it was impossible." He spread his arms wide, gesturing grandly at the opulent room. "Look around you tonight, ladies and gentlemen. This beautiful waterfront estate, the exotic cars lining that cobblestone driveway, the extraordinary network of visionary people standing in this very room. This is what happens when you refuse to accept no as a final answer. This is the ultimate, undeniable payoff of pure, relentless hustle." The crowd erupted into enthusiastic, wholehearted applause. Prominent venture capitalists nodded in vigorous agreement, thoroughly fooled by his charismatic, confident performance. Brittany stood at the base of the staircase in her glittering $15,000 gown, clapping loudly and beaming up at her husband as though he were a returning conqueror. As the applause began to settle, my father stepped forward. Richard held his own glass of bourbon, his chest puffed out with manufactured paternal pride. He walked up the first few carpeted steps to stand directly alongside Jamal, then motioned graciously for the crowd to quiet. An event coordinator appeared instantly at his elbow, handing him a wireless microphone. "If I may be permitted to add just a few words," Richard announced, his voice resonating richly through the mansion's premium acoustic system. As Jamal's father-in-law, I have had the extraordinary privilege of a front-row seat to this incredible journey from vision to reality. Jamal and Brittany represent the absolute pinnacle of everything this family has ever stood for. They are the living embodiment of true success, real ambition, and financial brilliance of the highest order. Richard paused. His eyes swept slowly and deliberately across the opulent foyer, panning over the designer suits and sparkling jewelry of the assembled guests, until his gaze locked with cold, calculated precision directly onto me. I was still standing beside the pillar in my faded, unraveling gray sweater and worn canvas sneakers, holding my empty silver tray. The contrast between my deliberately manufactured poverty and the surrounding luxury was stark and deliberately jarring. Richard raised one finger and pointed it straight at me, ensuring all 150 pairs of eyes in the room followed the gesture with obedient, curious precision. "I want you to look right over there, ladies and gentlemen," Richard said, his voice carrying through the sudden, attentive silence with practiced authority. "Take a long, hard, honest look at my eldest daughter, Alyssa. She is a living, breathing cautionary tale, a real-world illustration of what happens when a child refuses every advantage placed in front of her. We tried to give her the world. We tried to guide her toward a respectable, lucrative, meaningful career. Instead, she chose stubbornness. She chose to waste her most productive years drawing silly little pictures for spare change. She married a man with no drive, no ambition, and no ability to provide for a family, and now she is reduced to sneaking in through the catering door to serve drinks at her younger sister's mansion simply to make her rent." A collective rippling gasp moved through the crowd. Several guests looked immediately away, visibly uncomfortable with the raw, ugly spectacle of the public humiliation unfolding in front of them. Others stared at me with open disgust and undisguised pity, whispering urgently behind their manicured hands. Patricia stood near the front of the assembled crowd, a cruel, triumphant smile stretching wide and satisfied across her face. She was savoring every single moment of my public degradation with the undisguised pleasure of someone who had been waiting years for this exact performance. Richard turned back to face Jamal, clapping him solidly on the shoulder once more. "But then you look at Jamal and Brittany. You see what happens when you combine genuine, innate talent with the wisdom to listen to the right people and the courage to execute a bold vision. They are the absolute embodiment of real success, and Patricia and I could not be prouder to watch them carry our family legacy forward into the future." The crowd offered another round of polite, slightly strained applause, visibly eager to move past the uncomfortable spectacle of my public dismantling and return to their vintage champagne and curated hors d'oeuvres. Jamal raised his glass again, turning back toward his audience, preparing to lead one final climactic toast to his own undeniable genius. This was the exact moment. The undercover agents in the command van were listening. The agents positioned invisibly throughout the mansion had already secured the perimeter. I had absorbed every insult, absorbed every cruelty, played the perfect broken victim for the full length of the evening. I had let them publicly claim ownership of this fraudulent empire with full confidence and zero fear. It was time to spring the trap. I set the heavy silver serving tray down on the nearby marble console table. I made certain it landed with a loud, deliberate, resonant clatter that cut cleanly through the settled quiet of the foyer and echoed off the marble walls. Jamal looked down from the staircase, his arrogant smile faltering for a fraction of a second. He leaned slightly over the ornate banister, his expression shifting from smugness to irritation. "What exactly do you think you are doing, Alyssa?" he muttered, his voice low and sharp with warning. "Get back into the kitchen immediately." I did not move. I did not look away. I looked directly up at him, pitching my voice with careful, deliberate precision so that it carried cleanly and unmistakably to every investor, every politician, and every socialite assembled in that glittering room. I am just so genuinely inspired by your speech, Jamal, I said, my tone perfectly, innocuously calm. Your story of building this tech empire from absolute scratch is truly extraordinary. But I do have one quick professional question for you, since we happen to be surrounded by so many brilliant, experienced venture capitalists here tonight. The room was completely silent. Even Richard looked momentarily confused, his brow furrowing as he tried to calculate exactly what I was doing. How exactly did you manage to secure your initial $6 million in seed funding? I asked, my voice ringing out into the absolute stillness. Without possessing a single working prototype, a single line of original code, or even one actual paying customer? A visible ripple of confusion moved rapidly through the assembled investors. Several men in carefully tailored expensive suits turned to look at Jamal with newly sharpened, skeptical eyes. Their eyebrows rose almost simultaneously. A tech startup securing $6 million in seed capital with zero deliverables, zero proof of concept, and zero traction was not just unusual. It was completely unheard of in legitimate venture capital circles, and with actual industry experience knew it. Jamal's face flushed deeply, a combustible mixture of rage and towering, reflexive, egotistical pride. He was too fundamentally arrogant to recognize that he was being carefully interrogated on a federal wiretap in front of 150 witnesses. His ego swallowed the bait whole. He let out a loud, booming, deliberately condescending laugh designed to shrink me in front of his admirers. It is called having brilliant, discerning private backers who trust my genius completely and unconditionally, Alyssa. Jamal announced proudly to the room, projecting his voice with theatrical confidence. It is called having elite investors who recognized my unparalleled vision from the very beginning and happily wired $6 million in liquid capital directly to my company, because they knew, without a single doubt, that I would turn it into a billion-dollar empire. You simply would not understand how high-level finance operates at this scale. He had barely finished his last syllable when a sound erupted through the mansion that shattered the carefully curated atmosphere of the gala into absolute pieces. A deep, thunderous impact shook the air of the grand foyer. The towering mahogany front doors of the mansion were forcefully, dramatically pushed open from the outside. The heavy carved wood slammed back against the marble walls on both sides with a resounding percussive crash that made multiple guests physically flinch and stumble backward. Crystal flutes trembled in people's hands. The string quartet, who had been poised to resume playing, went completely still. A sharp, disorienting silence fell over all 150 wealthy guests simultaneously. Every single head in the room turned toward the grand entrance. Stepping through the threshold out of the cold, rainy Seattle night was my grandfather Harrison. Despite his 78 years, despite the severe cardiac condition that had kept him quietly sequestered on his European estate for the better part of 2 years, he walked into that room like a titan stepping calmly into a world populated entirely by smaller, lesser things. He wore a perfectly tailored midnight black suit that radiated quiet, absolute authority. His custom cane struck the marble floor with measured, deliberate precision. He was not alone. Flanking him on all sides was a formidable, disciplined phalanx of men in sharp, dark suits who moved with synchronized, predatory efficiency. Some were his private security detail. I recognized them from the hospital, but I knew with absolute certainty exactly who the others were. They were undercover federal agents, and they fanned out immediately upon entry, moving with practiced purpose to cover and secure every major exit in the mansion. The sheer combined presence of my grandfather and his formidable entourage caused the temperature in the already tense room to plummet perceptibly. The assembled wealthy guests parted in a wide, instinctive arc, murmuring in confused, urgent whispers as multiple people recognized the legendary shipping tycoon who had just materialized, uninvited, inside the waterfront estate, funded entirely with his stolen money. At the top of the grand marble staircase, Jamal froze completely. His glass of expensive bourbon hung suspended halfway to his lips, forgotten. The practiced, arrogant smirk evaporated from his face in an instant, replaced by a look of raw, undiluted panic that he had absolutely no ability to conceal. Beside him, Richard and Patricia went white. All the color drained simultaneously from my mother's carefully made-up face, leaving her looking hollow and genuinely frightened under the harsh, unforgiving light of the crystal chandelier. For 2 years, they had operated under the ironclad certainty that Harrison would never leave his European estate, that his health, his distance, and his reliance on them would protect them indefinitely. They had built their entire fraudulent empire on that single, catastrophic assumption. And now the architect of the trust they had spent 2 years systematically looting was standing inside the mansion those stolen funds had purchased. Desperation overrode shock. Patricia and Richard scrambled down the marble staircase, their polished shoes clicking urgently against the stone. They plastered identical, wide, frantic smiles across their faces, desperately clinging to the performance of the perfect, welcoming, successful family in front of the crowd of elite witnesses they had spent all evening so carefully cultivating. "Dad," Patricia stammered, positioning herself directly in Harrison's path, her voice pitched unnaturally high and bright. "We had absolutely no idea you were flying back to Seattle. You should have called us. We would have arranged a proper reception for you. This is such a wonderful surprise." She shifted her body deliberately, moving sideways in a frantic, transparent attempt to block Harrison's line of sight, specifically his view of me, standing near the catering console in my threadbare gray sweater. Richard flanked her immediately, reaching out with a visibly perspiring hand to place on Harrison's shoulder in a display of welcoming warmth. "Harrison, what an extraordinary surprise. You are just in time to celebrate Jamal's incredible tech launch. Let us find you a seat and get you a drink. You must be exhausted from the journey." Harrison did not look at either of them. He did not acknowledge Patricia's frantic greeting. He did not accept Richard's outstretched hand. His face was an absolute, unreadable mask of cold, terrifying indifference, the expression of a man who has already decided exactly what comes next and feels no need to announce it. He did not say a single word to the 2 people who had stolen $6 million from his trust and systematically tortured his eldest granddaughter. Instead, Harrison simply raised his elegant cane. With a single fluid, unhurried, entirely deliberate motion, he placed the heavy wooden shaft flat against Richard's chest. He applied firm, measured, undeniable pressure, pushing the cowardly man cleanly and completely out of his path. Richard stumbled backward 2 full steps, his face flooding with humiliated crimson in front of every local politician, business leader, and investor he had spent the entire evening desperately trying to impress. Patricia gasped audibly, shrinking backward as one of Harrison's bodyguards stepped forward to ensure the path ahead remained unobstructed. Harrison walked forward. His cane tapped against the imported marble floor with slow, rhythmic, absolute certainty, each strike echoing through the cavernous room like the measured tick of a countdown clock approaching 0. He walked past the frozen, parted crowd of elite guests. He walked past the stunned catering staff. He walked past the towering floral arrangements that had been purchased with the money stolen from my medical trust fund. He did not stop until he was standing directly in front of me. He looked at me where I stood beside the marble console table. His sharp, piercing blue eyes took in every detail. The frayed cuffs of my oversized gray sweater, my scuffed canvas sneakers, the heavy silver serving tray resting beside me. He saw the full, devastating physical reality of the poverty my parents had deliberately engineered and maintained, pressed in brutal, undeniable contrast against the $8 million of stolen luxury radiating from every surface surrounding us. A single muscle feathered quietly in his jaw. It was the only visible sign of the immense controlled rage burning beneath his outwardly composed exterior. He gave me one small, steady, reassuring nod, a single silent communication that told me everything I needed to know. The trap was perfectly secured. The authorities were fully in position. It was time. Harrison turned slowly to face the massive, bewildered crowd assembled before him. He leaned with quiet authority on his cane and projected his voice, deep, measured, and carrying with absolute effortless power to the very back wall of the mansion. "I sincerely apologize for the interruption to your evening," Harrison announced, silencing the last remaining whispers in the room with the sheer gravity of his presence. His gaze swept deliberately over the venture capitalists, the socialites, the politicians, and finally settled, cold and unblinking, on Jamal, trembling visibly at the top of the grand staircase. "You have all gathered here tonight to celebrate success and sound financial vision. Unfortunately, there has been a profound and deliberate misrepresentation of the facts surrounding everything you have seen and heard this evening." Harrison stepped slightly aside, extending one hand in a calm, measured gesture toward me. "My granddaughter has an announcement she would like to make regarding the true legal ownership of this real estate, the actual origins of this supposed technology company, and the precise source of the $6 million in seed funding you have been hearing about all night." The silence that fell over the grand foyer was absolute and total. 150 of Seattle's most powerful and influential citizens stood completely motionless, their eyes moving in unison between the formidable, silver-haired shipping tycoon leaning on his cane and the woman in the threadbare gray sweater standing at the edge of the catering console. I took one slow, deep, steadying breath. I felt the solid, reassuring weight of the hidden federal microphone pressed securely against my ribs. I reached into the battered canvas tote bag slung over my shoulder and drew out a thick, heavy manila folder. The crisp sound of stiff paper sliding cleanly from the canvas bag echoed through the vast marble room like a single, deliberate note. I stepped forward, moving away from the console and positioning myself in the precise center of the glittering foyer. Directly beneath the enormous crystal chandelier, in full, unavoidable view of every person present. I did not look at my panicking parents. I did not look at my horrified sister frozen at the foot of the stairs. I looked directly and only into the gathered sea of wealthy venture capitalists, local politicians, and high society influencers who had spent the entire evening drinking vintage champagne and enthusiastically toasting what amounted to a catastrophic multi-million-dollar federal fraud. "Since my family has been so extraordinarily eager to discuss financial success here tonight," I began, my voice ringing out across the absolute silence, calm and clear and perfectly, devastatingly steady. "I would like to formally introduce myself to all of you." I held the pause for exactly one breath. "My name is Alyssa. I am Richard and Patricia's eldest daughter. And far more relevantly, for the specific purposes of this lavish gathering tonight, I am the sole private backer of Apex Innovations." The wave of confused, urgent murmuring that swept through the affluent crowd was immediate and visceral. Prominent tech investors exchanged sharp, bewildered glances with one another. Several leaned instinctively closer, as though proximity to the woman in the scuffed canvas sneakers might help them make faster sense of what she had just said. I opened the thick manila folder with deliberate, unhurried calm. I flipped to the first document so that the bright red federal forensic accounting stamps were fully, unmistakably visible to every person standing in the front rows. I held it up clearly, turning it slowly so the nearest guests could see the official seals with their own eyes, the undeniable, documented proof of every word I was about to say. Every single dollar used to fund Jamal's fraudulent tech company, I said, projecting my voice with full, ringing clarity so that it reached the very back of the sprawling mansion without effort. Every single dollar used to purchase the fleet of Ferraris and Porsches currently sitting in the driveway outside. Every single dollar used to acquire this $8 million estate was systematically embezzled from my private medical and living trust fund over the course of the last 24 months. The reaction from the crowd was instantaneous and devastating. The collective gasp that erupted from 150 people simultaneously sounded like all the oxygen in the room being violently evacuated at once. The wealthy investors, people whose entire professional identities were built around identifying and aggressively avoiding financial risk and federal entanglement, felt the full catastrophic weight of my words land with physical impact. This was not petty family drama airing itself inappropriately at a social event. This was the explicit, documented public accusation of a massive, multi-million-dollar federal crime being described in precise detail by the granddaughter of Harrison Whitfield in front of witnesses. I turned to look directly at a well-known venture capitalist who had been among the loudest and most enthusiastic applauders during Jamal's speech just 15 minutes earlier. Apex Innovations has 0 working prototypes, I continued, my voice echoing relentlessly off the glittering chandelier above. It has 0 lines of original proprietary code, 0 viable products, and 0 actual paying customers. The $6 million in seed funding that Jamal was just publicly celebrating did not originate from brilliant private investors or elite banking institutions. It was systematically stolen from a private medical trust established by my grandfather, laundered through a network of illegal corporate shell accounts using forged federal tax documents bearing my signature, and used to pay for the designer gown my sister is wearing tonight, while my newborn son sleeps wrapped in a second-hand charity blanket. The physical reaction of the assembled crowd was immediate and complete. The investors standing nearest the grand staircase physically recoiled, stepping urgently and instinctively backward to create visible distance between themselves and Jamal. It was as though he had suddenly manifested a highly contagious and immediately lethal disease. Not a single person in that room with legitimate business standing wanted to be photographed within 10 feet of a man who had just been publicly and credibly accused of multi-million-dollar federal wire fraud in front of Seattle's most powerful and legally well-connected shipping magnate. The prominent socialites who had been fawning adoringly over Britney's $15,000 couture gown mere moments ago now looked at her with expressions of pure, undisguised revulsion. The glamorous, carefully constructed facade had been violently and permanently torn away, exposing the rotting, stolen core beneath the golden child performance they had been funding and feeding for years. At the top of the sweeping marble staircase, the grand illusion of Jamal's unshakable self-confidence shattered into 1,000 irretrievable pieces. He looked down at the rapidly retreating crowd, his eyes wide and filling with a rising, suffocating panic he had absolutely no ability to contain or conceal. He gripped the smooth wooden banister so hard his knuckles went stark white under the blazing chandelier light. A loud, high-pitched, unhinged laugh erupted from him, a desperate, cornered sound that carried no amusement and every last note of raw, unfiltered terror. "She is completely insane," Jamal shouted, jabbing a shaking, frantic finger down at me. His voice cracked audibly on the last syllable, stripped entirely of its earlier practiced confidence. "Look at her. She came in through the catering entrance dressed like a beggar. She is clearly in the middle of a severe mental breakdown right now. Do not listen to a single word she is saying." He pivoted wildly toward my father on the steps beside him, his eyes wide and pleading for a lifeline that no longer existed anywhere in the room. He was completely, catastrophically unaware that the undercover federal agents who had spent the entire evening posing as catering staff, bartenders, and investors had already quietly and methodically locked every heavy mahogany door in the mansion from the inside. "Richard, get your insane daughter out of this room right now!" Jamal screamed, his arrogant facade dissolved entirely into raw, unchecked animal fear. "Call your security team immediately and have her thrown out into the street before she destroys everything I have built." He waved his arms in wide, frantic arcs, demanding that someone, anyone, silence me. He was completely oblivious to the fact that every frantic, incriminating word pouring out of him was being captured in perfect, admissible audio by the FBI. The trap had been sprung with absolute perfection. Every exit was sealed. Every confession was recorded. Every participant was present and accounted for. I looked up at Jamal where he stood trembling and unraveling on the staircase above me, and I smiled. Slow, cold, and completely unhurried. I was entirely, serenely prepared to watch every single carefully stolen piece of their world burn to the ground. The echo of my revelation hung in the vast cavernous foyer, pressing down on the last gasping remnants of the elegant gala like a physical force. I held my cold, steady smile and kept my eyes locked directly on Jamal's terrified face without flinching. For one fractured, suspended moment, nobody in the room moved at all. The sheer, accumulated magnitude of the truth had paralyzed the space completely. Then the pristine, flawlessly maintained facade of my mother disintegrated. Patricia lunged forward, her stiletto heel slipping dangerously on the polished marble floor. The composed, sophisticated, immaculately presented matriarch she had so carefully performed all evening vanished entirely, replaced in an instant by a cornered, unhinged woman watching the walls of her meticulously constructed life collapse around her. Her face contorted into a mask of pure, unfiltered, desperate rage. The veins in her neck stood out clearly as she screamed, "Liar!" Patricia's voice tore through the mansion like something physical, a sound containing genuine panic beneath its venom. "You ungrateful, jealous wretch! You have been jealous of your sister your entire pathetic life. You are having a complete psychotic break. Security. Someone call security this instant. Remove this woman from my daughter's home before she destroys everything with her delusions." She waved her arms in wild, erratic sweeps, her heavy diamond bracelets crashing together repeatedly, her pointed finger stabbing toward the men in dark suits standing positioned near the walls. She was commanding the security she believed was still loyal to her to drag me out by force. Richard grabbed her arm, pulling hard, trying to physically restrain her and prevent the situation from deteriorating further, his own face a portrait of sweaty, grim-eyed terror. He could read the room far more clearly than Patricia in this moment. He had recognized the federal agents the moment Harrison walked in. He knew with sickening certainty that the game was irretrievably over. But Patricia was too completely consumed by her narcissistic fury, too deeply invested in her own invincibility, to process the signals screaming at her from every direction. She kept shrieking, kept demanding that the hired help physically remove me from the premises, kept reaching desperately for a power she no longer possessed. Several men dressed in crisp catering uniforms and well-fitted dark suits stepped forward with immediate coordinated purpose. Patricia drew in a sharp, triumphant breath, fully expecting them to close in around me and drag me toward the door. Up on the staircase, Jamal released a shaking, unsteady sigh of relief and leaned heavily against the banister, his knuckles still white, watching the men advance. The men did not look at me. They did not raise a hand toward my faded gray sweater. Instead, they moved with terrifying, synchronized military-grade precision, forming an immediate, unbreakable physical barrier between my family and every exit door in the grand foyer. The man who had spent the better part of an hour quietly wiping down the catering console stepped directly and deliberately in front of Patricia, cutting off her path completely. He reached into the inner breast pocket of his tuxedo jacket in one smooth, practiced motion. He did not produce a walkie-talkie. He did not produce a phone. He produced a heavy, gleaming gold badge and held it up directly under the full blazing light of the crystal chandelier so that every single person in the room could see it without any possibility of confusion. "Federal Bureau of Investigation," Special Agent Carter announced, his voice carrying through the sudden absolute silence with the calm, irresistible authority of someone who has performed this exact moment many times before. "Nobody leaves this room." The effect was instantaneous, total, and catastrophic. Across the full expanse of the massive foyer, a dozen additional men and women who had spent the entire evening performing flawlessly as wealthy venture capitalists, polished bartenders, and attentive security personnel simultaneously and unhesitatingly produced their own gold badges. The badges caught the chandelier light from every direction at once, a constellation of federal authority illuminating the stolen mansion from all sides. "Lock it down," Agent Carter commanded. The heavy mahogany front doors were immediately bolted from inside. Additional agents moved with rapid, practiced efficiency to secure the French doors opening onto the waterfront terrace, the side service entrance connecting to the catering kitchen, and every secondary exit in the building. Within 30 seconds, the $8 million stolen mansion had been completely and irreversibly transformed into a locked, fully secured federal crime scene. Total, immediate panic erupted among the 150 elite guests. These were powerful, prominent, deeply well-connected people, sitting politicians, celebrated business leaders, prominent venture capitalists with lawyers on retainer. The sudden, visceral realization that they were standing in the center of an active, large-scale FBI raid sent visible shockwaves of terror cascading through the crowd. Prominent socialites gasped and pressed themselves instinctively against the marble walls. Several venture capitalists who had been photographed warmly shaking Jamal's hand not 40 minutes earlier scrambled frantically for their cell phones, faces white, desperately needing to reach their corporate legal teams. "Phones away," an agent instructed firmly, moving along the edge of the crowd with calm, authoritative purpose. "Everyone remains exactly where they are. You are currently detained within an active federal crime scene. Do not attempt to alter, delete, or transmit any digital communications." At the top of the staircase, Jamal's knees buckled. He did not crumple all the way, but his legs folded visibly beneath him, and he sank down onto the carpeted steps in a slow, helpless collapse, his custom Italian suit suddenly looking less like the uniform of a self-made tech visionary and far more like the clothes of a man who has just understood, fully and finally, that he is going to prison. He stared down at the controlled chaos unfolding below him with the hollow, paralyzed eyes of someone watching the entire architecture of their life dismantle itself in real time. Then, the second phase of the operation began. Supervisory Agent Miller from the IRS Criminal Investigation Unit burst through the crowd at the far edge of the foyer, leading a tight tactical team of cyber specialists. Each member of the team carried heavy black equipment cases, rectangular, reinforced, anonymous-looking containers that held the forensic tools designed specifically to extract and preserve every shred of digital evidence before a single byte could be wiped, encrypted, or destroyed. They did not stop to engage with Jamal. They did not pause to speak with my parents. They bypassed the grand foyer entirely, taking the marble staircase 2 steps at a time and moving with urgent, purposeful speed directly toward the upper levels of the mansion, toward Jamal's executive home office, where the servers, the laptops, and the digital records of every fraudulent transfer, every laundered dollar, and every forged document were waiting. I watched them go, standing in the center of the glittering, ruined foyer, in my faded gray sweater and scuffed canvas sneakers, holding nothing but a manila folder of forensic accounting documents stamped in federal red. The trap had closed. Every door was sealed. Every confession was recorded. Every piece of digital evidence was being secured by people whose job was to ensure that none of it ever disappeared. And for the first time in 33 years, I was not the one at the bottom of this family's hierarchy. I was the one who had taken them apart. "We need those servers secured immediately." Agent Miller barked into his radio as he sprinted upward, taking the stairs 2 at a time. "No remote access. Cut the main router now." I watched from the foyer as the federal tactical team breached the heavy oak doors of Jamal's private home office with coordinated mechanical precision. They moved with lightning speed, immediately yanking power cords from wall sockets, physically disconnecting desktop towers, and severing every cable linking the room's equipment to the outside world. Agents wearing anti-static gloves began methodically bagging Jamal's personal laptops, his encrypted external hard drives, and dozens of physical flash drives scattered across the surface of his expensive mahogany desk. They were severing the operational head of Apex Innovations before Jamal could even begin to think about triggering a remote wipe protocol that might destroy 2 years of incriminating digital evidence in a matter of seconds. Down in the foyer below, the full, irreversible reality of the situation finally crashed down on my mother. Patricia stopped screaming. Her mouth hung open in a silent, horrified gasp, her eyes fixed on the constellation of gold badges surrounding her from every direction. Then her legs gave out entirely. Richard had to lunge forward and catch her around the waist to prevent her from crumpling directly onto the imported marble floor. Brittany, still standing near the base of the grand staircase in her $15,000 couture gown, had begun to hyperventilate. Her manicured hands clutched at her throat as the full, devastating realization cascaded over her. That her entire constructed life of effortless, stolen luxury was actively evaporating in real time, in front of 150 witnesses, with cameras waiting outside. I stood perfectly still, my shoulders squared and my chin level, watching the toxic architecture of my family's empire crumble piece by piece under the weight of its own corruption. The federal lockdown was absolute and complete. There were no more lies capable of saving them. There were no manipulation tactics left in their arsenal that could alter what was about to happen. The empire they had built on my suffering, on my son's charity blanket, and my husband's exhausted weekend tutoring shifts, was being dismantled systematically and permanently, and I was going to watch every single agonizing second of their reckoning with clear, open eyes. Special Agent Carter stepped forward, breaking the frozen, stunned tableau of the grand foyer. He gave a single sharp gesture to the 2 federal agents flanking him on either side. They moved in perfect, unhurried unison, stepping with deliberate purpose directly toward Richard and Patricia. My father attempted to puff out his chest, an old, deeply ingrained reflex designed to assert dominance, to reclaim the commanding presence that had intimidated people his entire adult life. But his body betrayed him completely. His hands were shaking. His color was gone. "Richard," Agent Carter said, his voice ringing with absolute, unshakable authority through the silence of the massive foyer. "You and your wife are being placed under federal arrest. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford one, an attorney will be provided for you at no cost." As the Miranda warning was recited with practiced, methodical calm, the sound that cut most sharply through the air was not a voice. It was the metallic, definitive click of handcuffs. The sound was precise and utterly final. The auditory period at the end of a very long and very ugly sentence. An agent pulled Richard's arms firmly behind his back and secured the cold steel links around his wrists. Another agent moved toward Patricia without hesitation. My mother, the sophisticated, untouchable, carefully curated matriarch who had spent my entire life engineering my inadequacy and making me feel like garbage wrapped in human skin, collapsed into a weeping, hyperventilating wreck before the agent had even finished securing the second cuff. No! Patricia wailed, the sound tearing out of her throat like something animal and desperate, raw in a way that her every previous calculated performance had never been. Several of the nearby venture capitalists physically flinched and stepped back. You cannot do this to us. We are respected members of this community. We are known in this city. Dad, do something. Harrison did not move a single muscle. He stood exactly where he had positioned himself, still, straight, and leaning on his cane, and watched his daughter with eyes as cold and deep and utterly unmoved as a winter ocean. Patricia's knees gave way completely. She collapsed down onto the imported marble floor, her expensive designer dress pooling around her in a crumpled, deflated heap that bore absolutely no resemblance to the regal silhouette she had carried into this room just hours earlier. She sobbed hysterically, her precisely applied makeup running in dark, ugly streaks down both sides of her face, begging anyone still willing to meet her eyes to intervene on her behalf. Nobody moved toward her. Nobody spoke in her defense. Richard stood beside her, staring at the floor, his face burning with a deep and total humiliation that no amount of wealth or social standing would ever fully erase. He was completely paralyzed, not by confusion, but by the crushing final reality of his own actions catching up with him in the most public and spectacular way imaginable. Agent Carter showed neither softness nor ceremony. You are both being formally charged with multiple counts of federal wire fraud, grand larceny, embezzlement from a protected medical trust, and forgery of federal tax documents. The agents hauled Patricia to her feet, holding her upright by both arms as she continued to thrash and sob and plead with anyone who would listen. Nobody would. Up on the grand sweeping staircase, Jamal watched his powerful, self-appointed in-laws being dragged away from the party they had thrown with money stolen from my medical trust fund. The practiced, arrogant swagger he had performed all evening was gone so completely it was difficult to believe it had ever existed. What replaced it was the frantic, twitching energy of a cornered animal with no remaining options and no remaining allies. He wiped a thick, visible sheen of sweat from his forehead with the back of his trembling hand. As Supervisory Agent Miller from the IRS Criminal Investigation Unit approached the base of the stairs with measured, unhurried steps, Jamal threw both hands into the air in a gesture of desperate, preemptive surrender. He tried, instinctively and pathetically, to puff out his chest one final time, to resurrect some fragment of the tech billionaire persona he had been performing for 2 years. The effort was embarrassing. Hey, listen to me, Jamal stammered, his voice cracking on every other syllable as he took one cautious step down the carpeted staircase. I am just the CEO. I handle the vision. I handle the tech side. I have absolutely nothing to do with the financial structure of the company. My in-laws managed all the corporate accounting and the bank transfers. They set up the trust fund routing entirely without my input. I did not steal a single dollar from anyone. He pointed a shaking finger directly and immediately at Richard and Patricia, instantly, without hesitation, throwing the 2 people who had funded his entire existence straight underneath the federal bus. Jamal was not just willing to let them rot in federal prison. He was eager. He flashed a nervous, pleading attempt at a smile at the agents surrounding him. I am completely innocent in this. I was just focused on executing my vision and building the startup. You have the wrong person. I am the victim here. Agent Miller stopped at the base of the staircase and looked up at Jamal with an expression of cold, clinical disgust that contained not a single gram of sympathy or credulity. He did not buy one syllable of the defense. Agent Miller reached into his inner jacket pocket and produced a precisely folded corporate document, which he held up at full extension so Jamal could see it clearly from the stairs. You are the sole registered managing member of Apex Innovations, Agent Miller stated, his voice cutting through Jamal's avalanche of excuses with the flat, undeviating precision of a surgical instrument. You hold 100% of the legal liability for this corporate entity. You accepted $6 million in stolen funds. You then actively and deliberately claimed those stolen funds as legitimate corporate revenue to secure fraudulent bank financing for this $8 million mansion and the fleet of exotic vehicles currently sitting in your driveway. Jamal's eyes went wide. He opened his mouth. No sound came out. Agent Miller took one measured step closer and delivered the absolute crushing final blow. To make the situation substantially worse, you failed to pay federal corporate taxes on any portion of that fraudulently claimed revenue. The federal government has no interest in your tech vision, your hustle narrative, or your personal brand. We care exclusively about the numbers. You engaged in deliberate, large-scale money laundering. You are looking at 15 years in a federal penitentiary for the tax evasion charges alone. And that number does not include the additional penalties for bank fraud and receiving stolen property. All color drained from Jamal's face in a single, visible wave, leaving him looking hollow and gray under the chandelier light. His mouth remained open. His breathing became rapid and audible from across the room. The full, irreversible weight of what Agent Miller had just said settled into his chest like concrete. 15 years. He was not a tech genius. He was not a visionary. He was not a self-made man or a disruptor or a hustler. He was a federally indicted criminal who had blindly signed his name to a scheme he had never fully understood. Seduced by the comfort of luxury and the praise of people who had been engineering his destruction from the very first day they welcomed him into the family. Jamal staggered backward on the staircase, his hands clutching at his chest as a full, undeniable panic attack seized him. The 150 wealthy investors and local politicians who had been hanging on his every word less than an hour ago now watched from a careful, deliberate distance, backs turned, faces averted, actively constructing physical and social space between themselves and the man on the stairs. He was entirely isolated, federal agents on all sides, the crowd retreating, the exit doors sealed, his digital evidence already bagged and labeled upstairs. I stood near the catering console, watching the slow-motion destruction of the man who had dropped a bruised $10 fruit basket onto my hospital bed while wearing a watch paid for with money meant to cover my prenatal care. Jamal gasped for air, his knees shaking so violently he had to grip the mahogany banister with both hands to keep himself upright. The last remaining ounces of his arrogance were being pulverized, ground to dust, by the sheer, specific, documented enormity of the federal charges bearing down on him. He looked wildly around the room for a lifeline, for a sympathetic face, for any exit at all. There was none. This was the exact moment I had been waiting and working toward since I sat in that dingy diner booth with Naomi 3 days earlier. I stepped away from the catering console and walked with deliberate, unhurried calm directly toward the base of the staircase. The federal agents on either side of the foyer did not move to stop me. They watched in quiet, knowing stillness, fully aware of what I was carrying and exactly what I was about to do. I reached into my battered canvas tote bag and drew out the single most explosive piece of documentary evidence Naomi had uncovered during our 3-hour forensic accounting session: the federal tax authorization form bearing Jamal's name, but not Jamal's handwriting. I walked directly to the bottom of the stairs and looked up into his terrified, sweating face. "They did not just set you up as the corporate scapegoat, Jamal," I said, my voice ringing with a cold, ringing clarity that carried through the dead silence of the mansion to every corner of the room. "They made absolutely certain that if the federal government ever came knocking, there would be a flawless, documented paper trail leading directly to you, and completely, deliberately, irreversibly away from them." I held the document out and pressed it into his trembling hand. "Look at the signature on your primary corporate liability form," I instructed him, holding his gaze with my own. "Look at it very closely. Look at the date. Look at the handwriting. You did not sign that document, did you?" It was not a question. Jamal stared down at the page. His eyes moved rapidly across the dense legal text until they reached the signature line at the bottom. He blinked. For a fraction of a second, genuine confusion crossed his face. He read the signature, his own name, spelled out correctly. But then something shifted. His eyes narrowed. He stared at the looping, distinctive letter forms. He saw the sharp, aggressive slant of the capital A. He saw the bubbly, almost juvenile loops on the lowercase y. I watched the precise, identifiable moment his heart broke open. He knew that handwriting. He had watched it sign birthday cards and grocery lists and notes left on the kitchen counter. He had watched it sign their marriage certificate. Jamal raised his head very slowly, his eyes, wide now, and filled with something beyond panic, something closer to the specific agony of a wound delivered by someone who was supposed to be the one person who never would, moved away from the forged signature and locked, with terrible, total certainty, onto his wife. Brittany was standing several feet away in her shimmering $15,000 couture gown. She was trembling visibly, taking small, frantic backward steps toward the staircase, trying to create distance between herself and the dawning recognition she could see spreading across her husband's face like a tide she could not stop. "You," Jamal whispered. The word barely made it out of his throat, but in the complete, suffocating silence of the sealed mansion, it landed like a thunderclap, a single syllable that contained the full weight of 2 years of marriage, of trust, of a future that had just been retroactively dismantled. Brittany shook her head rapidly, her eyes darting in rapid, desperate triangulation between Jamal, the federal agents, and her handcuffed parents. "Jamal, please," she stammered, her hands raised defensively in front of her. "Mom and Dad said it was the only way to protect the money. They said if I just signed the forms for you, we would never have to worry about anything, ever again. I did not know it was illegal. I swear to God, I did not know." Jamal's face contorted. The rage that moved across it was so profound, so absolute, so stripped of any remaining performance or pretense, that it was genuinely frightening to witness, even for someone who had waited years for exactly this moment. The specific, nauseating realization that the woman he had married had deliberately signed his name to federal documents, had knowingly and willingly handed him a 15-year federal prison sentence in order to protect her thieving parents and preserve her own access to stolen luxury, hit him with the force of something physical. "You forged my signature?" Jamal roared, his voice tearing out of him, raw and cracked and completely undone. "You made me the fall guy for your parents. I married you. I trusted you with everything I had, and you handed me over to the IRS. You signed my life away to protect their stolen fortune." Brittany collapsed. She did not lower herself. She simply fell, her expensive dress billowing around her on the marble steps like a deflating balloon, her body folding into itself as she sobbed hysterically. She screamed that she was sorry, that she had never meant for it to go this far, that she had done what her parents told her to do because she did not know how to refuse them, because she had never once in her entire life been required to face a consequence. Her apologies fell into the room and disappeared, heard by no one who had any interest in receiving them. The golden couple, the living embodiment of my parents' carefully manufactured success narrative, the shining advertisement for the life that had been stolen from me, was tearing itself apart in real time on a marble staircase in front of 150 of Seattle's most prominent citizens. The gleaming facade had not just cracked, it had detonated. I watched them implode with no sympathy, no regret, and absolutely no remorse. The dominoes were falling in precisely the order they had always been destined to fall. The destruction was complete, and it was entirely of their own making. Jamal stood on the staircase for a long, shaking moment, staring down at Brittany where she had collapsed on the steps below him. His fists were clenched at his sides. His jaw was set. The silence in the foyer was absolute, broken only by Brittany's ragged, hiccuping sobs and the distant sound of rain against the mansion's floor-to-ceiling windows. Then Jamal completely lost control. He lunged down the remaining steps, stopping inches from Brittany, towering over her with every remaining ounce of his considerable physical presence. The arrogant tech visionary was gone. What replaced him was a man who had been detonated from the inside. "I trusted you," Jamal roared, his voice cracking on the last word in a way that made several guests wince and look away. "I married you, and you signed my life over to the federal government. You forged my name on federal documents to protect your thieving parents so you could keep playing rich with money that was never yours. You set me up. You looked me in the eye every single day for 2 years and you set me up." Brittany scrambled backward on the steps, her stiletto heels slipping dangerously on the marble, her hands raised and shaking in front of her face. She was sobbing too hard to form coherent sentences. Jamal did not stop. He backed her against the base of the banister and unleashed everything, every obscenity, every accusation, every specific betrayal, his voice echoing off the crystal chandelier in waves that rolled through the silenced crowd. The elite venture capitalists and local politicians who had been drinking vintage champagne and congratulating him on his visionary genius less than an hour ago stood completely frozen, watching the man of the hour devolve in real time into a furious, betrayed, federally indicted criminal with nothing left to lose. Then Jamal's survival instincts cut through the rage like a cold blade. He turned sharply away from his weeping wife. He was a man who understood, on some fundamental level, that the only currency he had remaining in this room was his willingness to cooperate. And that currency had a very limited expiration window. He locked eyes across the marble floor with Special Agent Carter and Supervisory Agent Miller, raised both hands in a gesture of complete and deliberate surrender, and began to talk. "I will tell you absolutely everything," Jamal announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the sealed foyer. "I want to negotiate a deal, and I will give you every single detail right now, on the record. I did not orchestrate this financial structure. Richard did. Richard built the entire framework." Richard, still struggling against his handcuffs, went a shade of white that made him look physically ill. "Shut your mouth, Jamal," he bellowed, his voice stripped of every last shred of its customary authority, reduced to raw, transparent panic. "Do not say another word to these agents, not one word. Ask for a lawyer." Jamal did not even glance in his direction. He pointed a steady, deliberate finger at my father and began pouring out every carefully guarded family secret in a rapid, continuous, devastating stream, broadcasting my parents' federal crimes to the assembled crowd of investors as clearly and directly as if he were giving a product presentation. Richard designed the entire operation, Jamal confessed, the words tumbling out with the pressurized urgency of someone who knows the window for cooperation is closing. He told me Apex Innovations was a legitimate corporate tax shelter for private investment capital. He walked me through the structure himself, step by step. But he and Patricia retained actual administrative control over the cash flows the entire time. They used fake vendors to launder the trust fund money through the LLC. They created two separate phantom entities, a marketing firm registered in Delaware and a logistics consulting agency in Nevada, and generated false invoices paid directly out of the company accounts. The clean cash was then routed into offshore holding accounts. Agent Miller had not moved. He was listening with the focused, absolutely still attention of someone who already knows what is coming and is simply allowing it to arrive. Jamal continued, turning to face the IRS agents directly. They have two holding accounts in the Cayman Islands and a private wealth management account in Cyprus. Richard maintained master ledgers detailing every single transfer. The physical ledgers are locked in a concealed safe installed behind the bookshelf in his private home office. I know the combination. I will give you the combination right now, this minute, if it helps my case. The assembled venture capitalists reacted with a collective, audible gasp that swept through the crowd like a physical wave. The brazen, detailed admission of offshore money laundering, delivered voluntarily, in real time, by the man whose name was on every corporate document, landed in the room with the weight of a confession made under oath. Jamal did not stop there. He wanted immunity, and he was willing to dismantle every remaining wall to get it. He detailed the precise mechanics of how Patricia had personally managed the daily intercepts, explaining how she had rerouted the bank notification system so that every alert meant for my accounts arrived instead in her email inbox. He described how she had used the stolen funds as collateral to secure the fraudulent mortgage on the waterfront mansion they were currently standing in. He delivered each revelation with the practiced clarity of someone who had been keeping these secrets for 2 years and was now experiencing the specific, violent relief of releasing them all at once. He threw Richard and Patricia under every available vehicle, then backed over them repeatedly. Watching her husband systematically dismantle her parents' criminal empire with every sentence he spoke, Brittany finally cracked under the accumulated, crushing pressure of her own situation. The terrifying reality slammed into her all at once, fully and without mercy. The endless luxury was gone. The designer handbags were gone. The waterfront mansion was already being plastered with federal seizure notices. The golden child had ceased to exist the moment Agent Carter produced his badge under the chandelier. What remained in her place was a 30-year-old woman who had never held a real job, who had never once been required to face the consequences of her own choices, staring down federal forgery charges with no parents free to intercede, no husband willing to protect her, and no safety net of any kind left anywhere in her life. Brittany dropped heavily onto the marble floor, her expensive gown billowing around her like the remnants of a life that was already over. She pressed both palms flat against the cold stone and sobbed with the full, unrestrained desperation of someone who has just understood, for the very first time, that no one is coming to save her. She looked up at the federal agents through her ruined makeup and made the same calculation Jamal had made 30 seconds earlier. "Mom made me do it," Brittany shrieked, her voice raw and stripped of every last pretension, pointing a trembling, perfectly manicured finger at Patricia. "Mom said Alyssa did not deserve the money, that it was practically going to waste. It was not my idea. None of it was my idea. They told me that if I just signed the tax authorization forms, I would never have to work for anything. Ever. They said Alyssa was too stupid and too passive to ever figure out what had happened." Her voice cracked on the last word, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "Patricia forced me to forge the signatures specifically because she did not want the IRS tracing anything back to her own name. Patricia's face went through several violent transitions in the space of 2 seconds. "You lying, ungrateful little brat!" Patricia screamed, straining so hard against the agents holding her arms that her feet left the marble floor entirely. "We did everything for you. We gave you this entire life. We sacrificed everything so you could have what you have, and you stand there and betray us the moment things get difficult?" "Keep your mouth shut, Brittany," Richard roared over both of them simultaneously, his voice cracking with the specific, desperate pitch of a man watching his last defense dissolve in real time. "Keep your mouth shut and ask for a lawyer. Do not say another word. We will sort this out." "There is nothing left to sort out," Jamal shot back, his voice overlapping Richard's, filling the foyer with an overlapping, chaotic chorus of recrimination and self-preservation. "You told me the seed funding was from your private investor network. We did everything for you. You used me to launder $6 million. Ask for a lawyer. You planned for me to take the fall from the very beginning." The pristine facade of the perfect, wealthy, successful American family had not merely crumbled, it had exploded. And in its place was something far more honest. A pack of cornered, frightened, selfish people tearing each other apart in a marble foyer, each one screaming their confessions at full volume in a race to purchase their own survival at the expense of everyone standing nearest to them. I stood beside my grandfather at the edge of the room and watched them devour themselves alive with a feeling that was not quite satisfaction, not quite relief, but something colder and cleaner and far more final than either of those things. Poetic justice, perhaps, delivered on time and in full. Special Agent Carter had seen enough. He gave a single, sharp nod to his team. Agents moved immediately, hoisting Jamal and Brittany to their feet, securing their wrists with the same heavy steel links that already bound Richard and Patricia. The screaming did not stop. The accusations kept flying across the foyer as all four of them were positioned for the walk that would take them out of this stolen mansion and into a world from which their wealth and their connections and their carefully maintained reputations could not protect them. The walk of shame was methodical and unhurried. The agents formed a tight, controlled perimeter around my four family members and began marching them in a line directly through the center of the grand foyer, through the full, unobstructed view of every investor, politician, and socialite who had come to this party to celebrate them. The crowd did not look away. Not a single person looked away. Instead, 150 pairs of eyes locked on with the fixed, unblinking attention of witnesses at a historic moment. And 150 smartphones rose simultaneously, capturing every second of the procession in the bright, unforgiving flash of their cameras. The light strobed across the marble like lightning, illuminating the terror on my father's face, the mascara streaking my mother's cheeks, the hollow devastation in Brittany's eyes, the twitching, cornered panic in every line of Jamal's body. Richard kept his head bowed, his face radiating the specific deep scarlet of a man who has just discovered that humiliation is the one thing his money cannot buy its way out of. Patricia had stopped fighting. She walked because the agents compelled her to walk, her head drooping, her expensive dress trailing on the marble she would never set foot on again. Brittany stumbled repeatedly in her high heels, each time caught by the steady, unsentimental grip of the agent assigned to keep her moving. The heavy mahogany doors swung open. Cold, driving Seattle rain swept into the grand foyer, and with it came something else entirely. The white, blazing floodlights of the local media, whose vans had materialized on the circular driveway the moment the federal vehicles arrived and had spent the last hour pressed against the wrought iron gates with cameras running and reporters shouting questions into the rain-soaked dark. Jamal, who had spent this very evening bragging at length about his relentless grind and his unparalleled vision, had to duck his head and turn his face away from the blinding camera flashes as two federal agents guided him firmly down the front steps of the mansion his arrogance had built and his in-laws' scheme had destroyed. Behind him, Richard and Patricia descended the same steps they had climbed a few hours earlier as the hosts of a celebration of their own genius. The federal transport vehicles waited at the base of the driveway, their doors open. One by one, my family was placed inside. One by one, the doors closed. I stood silently inside the mansion beside my grandfather, watching through the enormous glass windows as the last door sealed shut and the vehicles began to move. Their taillights disappeared slowly through the rain-slicked gates, carrying away the empire of lies that had been constructed on my suffering and my son's future. While the FBI managed the physical arrests and the perimeter outside, Supervisory Agent Miller and his team of IRS investigators began the systematic dismantling of the stolen luxury that surrounded us. They moved through the mansion with a cold, methodical efficiency that was genuinely extraordinary to observe. Agents pulled thick stacks of bright red federal seizure notices from their equipment bags and began affixing them to every asset of value in the building with the unhurried, purposeful rhythm of people who have done this many times before. The stark, vivid red of the notices looked like fresh wounds against the pristine white marble, the imported Italian leather furniture, and the custom art installations that lined the hallway walls. They plastered notices across the expensive modern canvases, across the custom home theater system, across the grand mahogany entrance doors. Outside, tactical agents moved methodically down the rain-wet cobblestone driveway, pressing the same glaring red stickers across the windshields of each gleaming Ferrari and Porsche in sequence. The same vehicles Jamal had gestured toward grandly during his speech less than 2 hours ago as evidence of the ultimate payoff of pure hustle. Every stick of designer furniture, every piece of custom lighting, every luxury vehicle, every asset in the building and on the property was officially seized by the federal government to be cataloged, auctioned, and liquidated as criminal restitution. The elite guests, finally released from the federal checkpoint one by one after their IDs had been logged and their contact information recorded, scattered into the cold rain with the desperate, hunched energy of people fleeing the blast radius of something catastrophic. The same venture capitalists and politicians who had sneered imperceptibly at my threadbare sweater earlier in the evening were now standing in a long, humiliating line in the cold, pulling out their driver's licenses under the watchful eyes of federal agents before they were permitted to step off the property. Their hushed, frantic whispers carried through the emptying foyer as they waited. They were openly discussing the total, catastrophic public implosion of the family they had spent the evening celebrating. Several were visibly calculating whether their attendance alone might trigger scrutiny of their own finances. They scurried into the Seattle rain, covering their heads with their expensive jackets, fleeing the radioactive fallout of greed they had toasted with vintage champagne. Slowly, the waterfront mansion emptied. The crowd departed. The catering staff gathered their equipment and left under federal supervision. The majority of the agents concluded their initial sweep and filed out in small, efficient groups. A skeletal crew remained to guard the seized property through the night. The silence that settled over the grand foyer was heavy and complete, and unlike any silence that had filled that room during the 2 years of its fraudulent existence. The crystal chandelier still burned brightly overhead, casting its cold, beautiful light over abandoned silver trays and half-eaten plates of caviar, over spilled vintage champagne pooling slowly against the marble grout lines, over empty chairs and discarded napkins and the lingering ghost of a party that had ended the only way it was ever going to end. It looked exactly like what it was. A hollow, soulless monument to unchecked greed, to the specific kind of cruelty that dresses itself in luxury and calls itself love. I stood in the center of the imported marble floor in my faded, oversized gray sweater and my scuffed canvas sneakers, and I took one long, slow, deliberate look around the silent, echoing space. Then I felt a warm, familiar weight settle onto my shoulder. I turned. My grandfather Harrison was standing closely beside me, leaning on his cane, his fierce blue eyes softer now than I had ever seen them, the hard, prosecutorial focus of the last several days replaced by something quieter and older and entirely genuine. He gave my shoulder a gentle, firm, affirming squeeze. "It is over," he said softly. His deep voice carried the specific, settled weight of a man who has spent a long time waiting to say something true and simple, and has finally arrived at the moment to say it. "They can never hurt you again." I nodded. I felt a weight lift off my chest, not suddenly, not dramatically, but in the way that things you have carried for so long you have stopped noticing them feel when they are finally, truly gone. A slow, profound, cellular release. I turned my back on the grand staircase, on the red-stickered luxury, on the ghosts of every version of myself that had stood in rooms like this, feeling small and ashamed and wrong. Harrison and I walked together through the open mahogany doors and stepped out into the cool, rain-washed Seattle night. David was waiting for me at the gate. He was holding an umbrella, and his eyes, when they found mine across the wet, dark driveway, were filled with the kind of love and quiet, steady pride that does not need to announce itself. I walked toward my husband, toward home, toward our son sleeping in a warm crib in a safe apartment with a functioning heater and food in the refrigerator. I left the glittering, fraudulent mansion behind me in the dark without looking back. I took one long breath of the rain-washed air, cold and clean and carrying the specific scent of things beginning to clear, and felt, for the first time in a very long time, the profound and absolute sensation of being entirely, irrevocably free. The heavy oak doors of the federal courthouse swung shut behind me with a deep, resonant thud that echoed through the mahogany-lined corridor and faded into the particular, heavy quiet of institutional justice. It had been exactly 7 months since the spectacular public collapse of my parents' empire at the waterfront mansion. The grinding machinery of the United States federal justice system had moved with a relentless, impersonal efficiency that left no room for the emotional manipulation my parents had relied on as their primary currency for their entire adult lives. There were no dramatic, tearful reconciliations in the courthouse corridor. No last-minute pardons, no family loyalty surfacing at the 11th hour to soften the blow. The reality of federal court was utterly and mercifully devoid of the tools that had always protected them before. Inside the courtroom, the air was stale and close. Richard and Patricia sat at the defense table looking nothing, absolutely nothing, like the confident, imperious socialites who had once circulated through parties like this one's very different previous iteration, parading me as a cautionary prop for their own superior narrative. My father had lost a significant amount of weight. His expensive tailored suits had been replaced by standard, ill-fitting clothing that seemed to belong to a smaller, older, more diminished man. My mother sat hunched over the table, her perfect manicured facade entirely erased by 7 months of extreme legal anxiety and the specific grinding dread of knowing exactly what is coming and being powerless to prevent it. They looked small, fragile, entirely irreversibly broken in the way that only people who have never once faced genuine consequences can look when consequences finally, fully arrive. The federal judge, a stern, compact woman with a reputation for zero tolerance in white-collar criminal cases and an ability to read a financial crime with the precision of a forensic accountant. Read the sentencing guidelines into the record with measured, methodical precision. She detailed the systematic, multi-year embezzlement of a medical trust fund established specifically to protect a struggling mother and her newborn child. She highlighted the calculated forgery of federal tax documents. She enumerated the interstate wire fraud carried out across 24 consecutive months. She described the architecture of the money laundering network with the flat, specific language of someone who has reviewed the evidence thoroughly and found it both comprehensive and damning. Then she put down the guidelines and spoke directly, without notes. She called their actions a grotesque abuse of parental authority, a profound and calculated betrayal of the most fundamental familial duty. She noted, with the particular weight of a judge who has presided over many such cases and finds this one noteworthy in its callousness, that the victims of this specific crime had included a newborn child, a pregnant woman, and a young couple who had spent 2 years clipping coupons and skipping meals, while $6 million intended for their survival was being used to fund a fabricated empire. When the gavel fell, it fell with the finality of something that cannot be undone. Richard and Patricia were each sentenced to 8 years in a federal correctional facility. No parole in the federal system. Nearly a decade behind bars, stripped entirely and permanently of their wealth, their social standing, their freedom, and the curated identity they had spent their entire adult lives constructing. I sat in the gallery and watched the federal marshals lead them away in handcuffs. My mother turned at the door to the holding area and looked back at me one final time. Her eyes were pleading, searching my face for a lifeline, for some shred of the daughterly love they had spent 33 years systematically extinguishing. She was looking for something to hold on to. I met her gaze with total, unwavering, absolute indifference. I felt no pity. I felt no grief. I felt no residual guilt for what had come to pass. The people who had engineered my suffering, who had watched my son sleep in a charity blanket while they transferred his future into offshore accounts, were finally paying the precise, specific price they had earned. I looked away first, not because I was uncomfortable, but because I was finished. The fallout for the golden couple was equally complete. The moment Jamal fully understood the magnitude of the tax evasion charges bearing down on him, 15 years, a number that had apparently lodged itself in his mind with the permanence of a splinter, his loyalty to Brittany evaporated with the speed and totality of morning frost in direct sunlight. He filed immediately for a highly publicized and ruthlessly executed divorce, then turned state's evidence against his own wife, providing federal prosecutors with every verifiable detail of Brittany's forgery of the corporate tax authorization documents in exchange for a significantly reduced sentence. The IRS, however, is not an institution that distributes immunity for money laundering based on cooperation alone. Despite Jamal's extensive and enthusiastic cooperation, despite his desperate performance as a victim of manipulation, the judge still sentenced him to 3 years in federal prison for deliberate tax evasion. The self-proclaimed tech visionary who had built an identity on his relentless grind and his unparalleled hustle was now, formally and permanently, a convicted federal felon. The Ferraris were gone. The waterfront mansion was gone. The Rolex and the tailored Italian suits and the lavish networking events with open bars were gone. What remained was a man whose defining professional achievement would, for the rest of his life, be listed in a federal court database. Brittany took the hardest fall of anyone. The golden child who had spent her entire existence insulated from every consequence by the enabling machinery of our parents' favoritism was suddenly, absolutely, and without ceremony, thrust into the brutal reality of federal prosecution with no safety net remaining of any kind. Richard and Patricia were locked away. Jamal was actively testifying against her. She faced her charges entirely alone, something she had never once been required to do with anything in her life. The handwriting evidence was unequivocal. The forensic analysis confirmed what I had known the moment I saw those federal documents in the diner booth. The looping Y, the aggressive slant of the A, the specific, distinctive juvenile letter forms that I had watched sign homework assignments I had completed on her behalf throughout our entire childhood. There was no plausible alternative explanation. There was no narrative she could construct that altered the physical evidence. Brittany wept hysterically in the courtroom, her composure entirely gone, begging the judge for leniency on the grounds that she had been manipulated and coerced by our parents since childhood. She was not wrong about the manipulation, but the judge was entirely unmoved by it as a mitigating factor, noting with pointed precision that being manipulated does not constitute a legal defense for the forgery of federal tax documents. Brittany was sentenced to 4 years in a federal correctional institution. The transition from a $15,000 couture gown to a standard-issue khaki prison uniform broke something in her that I do not believe was ever fully repaired. For 4 years, she scrubbed floors and served food in the prison cafeteria, a specific, dark, entirely unplanned echo of the exact humiliation she had attempted to engineer for me at the waterfront gala, standing in her diamonds while I carried a silver tray. When Brittany was finally released, she emerged into a world that had moved on entirely without her. The waterfront mansion had been liquidated by the federal government years earlier. The luxury vehicles were gone. Her marriage was a legal footnote. She was 34 years old, a convicted federal felon with a documented criminal record, unemployable in any sector that paid a meaningful wage, and carrying a massive IRS restitution order attached to her name that would garnish any earnings she managed to generate for years into the future. She ended up living in a tiny, dilapidated studio apartment on the industrial outskirts of Seattle, in the exact kind of neighborhood she had used to mock me for surviving in precisely the kind of unit she had once referenced with casual contempt when talking about my cramped one-bedroom apartment. She worked minimum-wage retail positions, her wages seized by the federal government the moment they appeared in her account. The untouchable golden child had arrived at absolute, unrelenting, undecorated rock bottom, and arrived there alone. One rainy Tuesday evening, nearly 5 years after the night of the raid, I was sitting in my warm, beautifully lit home studio, finishing a series of watercolor illustrations for a new children's book. A story about a small bird who learns, slowly and with difficulty, that the nest she was born into does not define the sky she is capable of reaching. My phone buzzed on the desk beside me. I glanced at the screen. Unknown number. I let it go to voicemail and kept working. A few minutes later, a notification appeared. I set down my brush, tapped the screen, and held the phone to my ear. It was Brittany. Her voice was thin and raspy and stripped of every affectation, the casual cruelty, the practiced condescension, the performative confidence that had always sharpened every sentence she directed at me. What remained was something small and genuinely desperate and faintly unrecognizable. She was sobbing quietly, the kind of crying that happens when there is no audience left to perform for. She was calling to ask for a loan. She could not afford her heating bill. The IRS was threatening to initiate proceedings against her remaining assets. She needed help. Just temporarily. Just a small amount. Just enough to get through the month. She said we were sisters. She said family was supposed to help each other in times of need. She said she was sorry, that she had never wanted things to end up this way, that she had been young and stupid and under the influence of people who had conditioned her entire life. I sat in my warm studio, in my beautiful craftsman house, in the quiet neighborhood with the oak trees in the garden, and I listened to the golden child beg for the precise category of scraps she had once gleefully denied me. I thought about the cold, drafty apartment I had brought Leo home to. I thought about borrowing $20 from a colleague to buy formula to get through a weekend. I thought about the Child Protective Services agent standing in my kitchen, opening my empty refrigerator, taking notes. I looked at the caller ID on my screen for a long, silent moment. I did not feel angry. I did not feel sad. I did not feel satisfaction or vindication or any of the things I might have expected to feel. I felt, with a profound and settled completeness, absolutely nothing at all. I picked up the phone. I found the number in my recent calls. I tapped the block caller button. I watched Brittany's number disappear permanently from my contacts, from my call history, from my life. I set the phone face down on the desk, picked up my favorite drawing pencil, and went back to work, leaving my toxic family exactly where they had always, ultimately, belonged, entirely in the past. The federal restitution process moved with the same thorough, methodical efficiency that had characterized every stage of the investigation. With my abusers secured in federal facilities and the fraudulent corporate shell of Apex Innovations fully dismantled, the courts acted quickly to rectify the financial devastation that had been engineered over 2 years of calculated theft. I sat in a sleek, sunlit boardroom across from Naomi and the federal prosecutors, signed the final stack of legal documents with a steady hand, and was officially restored as the sole, uncontested controller of my medical and living trust fund. The government had liquidated every seized asset with aggressive thoroughness. The waterfront mansion, sold at federal auction, the fleet of exotic vehicles, the designer wardrobes, the custom art, the home theater system, all of it converted to cash and directed through the restitution mechanism back toward me. Every dollar of the stolen $6 million was recovered and deposited, securely and completely, into accounts that bore only my name. When I saw that number appear on my own banking app for the first time, I did not feel the greedy, electric thrill that my parents and sister had apparently experienced when they redirected funds that were never theirs. What I felt was profoundly simpler. I felt relief. I felt the specific physical release of a fear I had been carrying since the moment I looked at Leo in that charity blanket and tried to calculate whether we could afford his first pediatric appointment. I felt certainty that my son would never shiver in a freezing apartment with an empty refrigerator, and parents too exhausted to pretend they were not frightened. With that recovered wealth finally in my hands, David and I made choices that deliberately, consciously rejected everything my toxic family had stood for. We did not buy a sprawling, ostentatious mansion to announce our arrival to high society. We did not acquire a single Ferrari or a designer wardrobe or any object whose primary purpose was to communicate our net worth to people whose opinions we did not value. We had watched what that kind of acquisition produced, and we wanted no part of its particular architecture. David and I spent months looking, and we finally found the right place. We purchased a beautiful, deeply comfortable craftsman-style home, nestled in a quiet, tree-lined neighborhood, the kind of street where neighbors leave vegetables on each other's porches, and children ride bikes in the late afternoon. It had an enormous garden in the back, filled with ancient oak trees and rambling flower beds that bloomed in succession through most of the year. It was a space designed for genuine warmth, for growing things, for breathing without the constant, suffocating weight of judgment pressing down from every direction. Financial security gave us the ultimate luxury, the luxury of choosing based on what we actually wanted. I invested a meaningful portion of the recovered trust funds in my work. I purchased a charming brick building in the downtown arts district and opened my own independent children's book publishing studio. Not just a space for my own projects, but a platform deliberately designed to do the thing I had always most wanted to do: give voice to artists and writers who had been pushed aside, underfunded, and told their work did not merit serious investment. I hired a dedicated team. I built a submission process specifically designed to find the stories that didn't fit the standard commercial mold. I provided advances, design support, and distribution to creators whose work deserved readers it had never been able to reach. Walking into the studio every morning and seeing a vibrant, thriving community of artists doing meaningful, difficult, beautiful work under a roof I had built from money that had been stolen from me was more genuinely fulfilling than any social performance my mother had ever aspired to. David's life transformed just as completely, and in precisely the way that suited him. He kept his job. Of course he kept his job. David loved teaching, loved standing at the front of a classroom full of teenagers who hadn't decided yet what they thought history meant, and helping them understand why it mattered, why it was still happening, why it had always been about them. He loved it in the way that some people love things that cost them nothing to love, because the activity itself is the reward. The difference was that now he taught without the crushing weight of financial terror pressing down on every weekend tutoring shift, every graded paper stack he carried home at midnight. The dark circles under his eyes disappeared. His shoulders lost their permanent hunch. He started bringing books home to read for pleasure again. He became, in the specific way that's only possible when survival anxiety finally releases its grip, more fully himself. Our very first financial priority, before the house, before the studio, before anything else, was Leo. Working with Naomi and a team of estate attorneys, David and I established a trust fund for our son that was ironclad, legally airtight, and structured with the specific, meticulous care of people who understand exactly how such things can be subverted. We built in protections I had learned about the hard way. We ensured that no trustee had unchecked unilateral authority. We created notification systems that went directly and only to Leo. We reviewed every provision with the specific goal of ensuring that nothing could be done to his future by anyone, including, theoretically, us, without his knowledge and consent. Leo's path was secured, fully, specifically, deliberately insulated from the kind of financial anxiety that had shaped so much of his parents' early lives. Time moved forward. The dark memories receded, not erased, exactly, but covered over by the accumulation of ordinary, golden, genuinely lived days. It was a warm summer afternoon of the particular quality that Seattle produces occasionally in the later months of the year, when the light turns amber and the air goes soft, and the whole city seems to exhale. I was standing in the sunroom of our craftsman house, which I had converted into a secondary art studio for days when I wanted to work close to the garden. The large French doors were pushed open wide, letting in the warm scent of blooming jasmine from the beds David had planted along the back fence. I was holding a warm cup of herbal tea, leaning against the wooden doorframe, looking out at the front porch. My grandfather Harrison was sitting in a sturdy wooden rocking chair on the porch, his cane resting against the railing beside him. The tense, vigilant aura he had carried throughout the investigation, the posture of a man managing a crisis from across an ocean while managing a cardiac condition at the same time, had faded entirely. What remained was something I had rarely seen in him before, and had assumed, incorrectly, was simply not part of his nature: ease. He looked relaxed and present and genuinely, specifically content. He had decided, after the sentencing was complete and the last of the legal proceedings had concluded, to spend his remaining years living with us, trading the cold isolation of his Swiss estate, with its professional staff and its medical supervision and its profound absence of anything resembling a family, for the chaotic, imperfect, irreplaceable warmth of a real home. Sitting on Harrison's lap was Leo. He was a toddler now, vibrant and energetic and endlessly, delightfully opinionated, his chubby legs kicking with the specific joy of someone who has not yet learned that the world requires any restraint. He was babbling a continuous, enthusiastic stream of sounds at his great-grandfather, some of them recognizable words, most of them a private language that apparently made perfect sense to both parties. Curled at the base of the rocking chair was the scruffy, affectionate stray we had adopted from the local shelter a few months earlier. A medium-sized dog of entirely ambiguous heritage who had immediately identified Harrison as his primary human and Leo as his personal entertainment system. The dog nudged Leo's dangling foot with its nose, causing Leo to dissolve into a cascade of loud, helpless giggles that spilled out across the porch and floated into my studio on the warm afternoon air. Harrison laughed with him. A deep, genuine, resonant sound that I had heard very rarely in my life and now heard almost daily. He reached up and adjusted Leo's sun hat with hands that were steady and careful and entirely gentle. I stood in the doorway and watched them, holding my tea, feeling the warmth of the afternoon settle into me. I looked at my grandfather's hands on my son's hat. I looked at the dog's contented sprawl. I looked at the garden beyond the porch, the oak trees moving slowly in the August breeze. I looked at the life I had built, not been given, not inherited, but built, specifically and deliberately, from the ashes of the worst thing that had ever been done to me. The shadows of Richard and Patricia, of Brittany and Jamal, felt as though they belonged to a different dimension entirely, a dark, airless place that could no longer reach the porch, where my grandfather rocked my son in the afternoon light of a summer I had never expected to arrive at feeling this way. I closed my eyes and let the warm breeze move across my face. They had taught me, for 33 years, that family is defined by blood, and that blood grants the right to take from you, and take from you, and take from you, and call it love. They had taught me to be small, to be grateful for their attention, to believe that I owed them something simply for having been born into proximity with them. But I learned, at a diner table covered in forensic accounting documents, in a hospital room with my newborn son, in a federal courtroom on a cold Monday morning, that true family is something else entirely. It is built from respect, from consistent protection, from the kind of love that grows rather than diminishes the person it is directed at. I did not just recover my inheritance, I recovered my life. And standing in the doorway of a home I had chosen, watching the people I had found and kept, with the garden blooming behind them and Leo's laughter still hanging in the summer air, I was certain, in a way I had never been certain of anything before, that I would never let anyone make me feel small again.